Yeah, I was going to read a little bit of everything here. I was kind of just going to dive in and do the whole thing on stream.
Sure.
There were some criticisms that you had about it. Do you want to go into that, or do you want to wait until?
Did you read those little videos I sent you?
I did watch the videos, yes.
Okay, so that kind of sums it up, which is, basically that, I'm in a world where I'm open to criticism, and I get a lot of criticism. I take positions that, that are, purposefully challenging.
Sure.
Not just to piss people off, because I think that's, where the truth lies, or at least my interpretation of it.
Yeah.
And, I expect in this community, I get pushback obviously from gender criticals. I get pushback obviously a lot from anti-trans or anti-transition people. And of
Yeah.
course, so I do take some criticism from probably the left who think I'm, uh, not towing the party line on the data.
Yeah.
And, so I'm open to people critiquing it and, having good faith discussions of I believe what I believe. We don't always necessarily come to agreement, but at least, I understand if, you talk to someone, sometimes you find out you missed something or there was something that you misinterpreted and you have a chance to, explain, why you believe, what the limitations are. And that's all cool. And, this is what I've been doing. Like, as you know, like I have this podcast where the whole point of it is to present people who disagree with me. And I have people who are more gender critical and I have people who are, very trans supportive or trans advocates. And the only thing we agree to is to be civil and talk things through in a single debate. Um, and people can have their opinions on whether that's a worthy project or a helpful project. And I think that's all fair ball. Um, the challenge is um, I think it's always best to keep things personal. I recognize I can't control how other people do a criticism, and sometimes criticism does get personal. And even when it does, I try to brush it off for the most part, or at least when necessary, defend my reputation or defend my position. Um, she included completely, in my opinion, unnecessarily, this reference to um, a, uh, a disciplinary action that I received in 2020 when I'm practicing in Manitoba. And I'll share the detail. Are we live right now?
Yes.
Like people are listening.
Uh,
There's details I can share. People are listening. There's
yeah. I
details
mean,
that I can share.
yeah.
Okay, like we're on the stream. I didn't know if we were just talking to two of us or if we're talking to
Yeah. No.
anybody
No.
listening.
The stream is live. Yeah.
Bring it on. Perfect. Okay, just so I know, because it concerns anyone who wants can go read this. Like I said, I prefer people not read it because one of the things I always worry about with this thing being present is that people will take it in bad faith because while everything in a censor is true, um, uh, there's a lot of background that wasn't part of the censor that actually really informs what prompted the whole issue. And the issue is that I was censored, which basically means that I accepted that I made a mistake with the government body of my province in 2020 because um, uh, I basically called someone a bad name in a private forum, and someone leaked the forum
Oh yeah.
more materials to that person, and that person obviously was upset. And the college was basically trying to set an example. There've been a few occurrences of this kind of behavior going on, and they wanted. And part of what the college does is they're trying to. Their duty is to protect the reputation of profession, of physicians.
Yeah.
And they don't like the idea of physicians arguing in the public eye. And even though this is private, anytime you do it in front of more than one person, it becomes public. And that was a mistake on my part. But it had to do with the nature. Like I said, I can't discuss the details publicly because there's people listening.
Sure.
But I will just say that I'm on the side of the angels in my criticism, and it was wrong for me to make this a public thing. But what I criticized was something that did turn out to be true, um, and uh, and that was involved, in my opinion, behavior that was damaging. And like I said, I should have handled it differently. I shouldn't have done it. I shouldn't have
Sure.
named him in a public forum. I shouldn't have aired my grievances with this person's behavior publicly. That was my mistake. I took my medicine, I accepted my punishment, I took the censure. And all that censure basically means is that I accepted that I didn't do anything wrong. It had nothing to do with patient care. It had nothing to do with malpractice. It had nothing to do with, and at this point, I was uh, living stealth. So,
Yeah.
the sleep wasn't anything to do with anything,
Right.
anything trans. The problem is that, when you have that on your record, people may draw their own interpretations of it. And I fully expect that, if a Turk wanted to do a hit piece on me, that they would look at this and just be like, look, bad, disciplined by your, disciplined by your professional body. This is a bad person, only bad people get disciplined. Um, and, but there's larger context. And like I said, I'm happy to explain to people, like someone who's writing a piece on you. And like if this was a journalistic outfit and they would reach out and say, hey, we're writing this piece on you, it's going to be critical. We want to make sure, if you have any comment about what we're writing, which is pretty standard,
Yeah.
if you're going to do that. And I recognize we're in blog land and everyone can play different rules. Is you would say, hey, yeah, here's some context.
Sure.
Here's something you might want to know that might cast this in a different light. And you can you can decide if you want to use this or not, because I don't control the internet.
Yeah.
But if you're sort of a good person and sort of trying to be a good journalist, you do that. And I know she sort of said it blocked her, and I did block her 24 hours because of an earlier encounter where she was going on and on and on, and I needed to bring the conversation to a close because
Yeah.
it was getting a little heated. And so I blocked her temper. I basically put her in timeout because I had other things to do that night, and I didn't really want to spend it arguing with Valerie.
Yeah.
But but I blocked her, I think, either the day after, the next day, just because actually before this, actually kind of liked her. I think she does really interesting. Like she's obviously more of a trans advocate, like pure trans advocate than I am, but I think she does. Like I thought her heart was into place. Like I know she does a lot of advocacy, and even though I disagree on some particulars, I live in a world where we're all fighting. Like we all have small goals. We're all fighting this battle in our own ways.
Yeah.
And we might have different tactics, we might have different ways, but like we're all I stand with trans dignity. I stand with people having access to the care they need. I stand with people who are trans and who will benefit from therapies, having access to these therapies, and for people who are trans not to face discrimination and to be able to live their lives and be respected, both in the world and to be happy. The goal is to flourish. I want people to flourish, and I think that's probably a shared goal of every trans person, regardless of your tactics. And I understand that people can think like, oh, your tactics are bad, or your tactics aren't going to work, or your tactics might actually bring harm, and that's perfectly valid. And obviously, I've arrived at my decisions because I'm thoughtful about them. They're not sort of pat clock. They're not, I didn't sort of scribble them on the back of a napkin and them yesterday. I'm a pretty thoughtful person.
Yeah.
But I respect if someone thinks differently and has a different battle plan. I might say, hey, I don't think that's going to work, but I'm not going to say don't do it. And if it turns out I'm wrong, man, if it turns out that the right battle plan was something different than me, I'm not going to poo-poo it. I'd be like, congratulations on winning this for us. Like that was, I've there's been many times over the course of my career, the course of my advocacy, where I sort of said, hey, I thought something different was going on here, but you were right. That's fair. Am I boring your audience yet?
No. I'm just trying to. I have a few questions for you. I just
Go
wanted
ahead.
to let you go ahead and get whatever preface out you wanted to before I dive into a couple of questions that I had popped up.
I'll just start just by saying who I am. I guess probably a lot of, I don't know who's listening or how many people are listening, but
not too many.
Work.
Trust me, no.
Not too many. Okay, so it's just basically you and I.
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay, that's fair. But here, I can make it sound like I'm speaking to hundreds. It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
I'm actually
no, I mean, people usually don't watch the live streams. They'll usually tune into the videos, because I'm going to break it up into 3 videos or whatever.
You'll make some clips and okay, cool beans. So, so first of all, in terms of why I believe what I believe, there's a number of things that sort of my opinions and my perspectives are informed by, and I think those are important to get on tables. The first is obviously I'm a trans woman. And I'm a long-established trans woman. I transitioned, I started my transition in 2000. I've been doing it full-time since early 2002. My entire professional life has been trans. And it's been, I'm not going to describe it as stealth, but it's been stealth in the sense that there's always been a few people in my life who know. But in my professional life, the number of people have been very limited. And I made my career not as sort of a trans person, but as someone who was presumed female. I was fortunate because, and this is like I said, a lot of success in transition is luck and luck and privilege, is that I had a lot of luck and privilege. I just had a body type that worked, and I had access to the kind of things that I needed to do to get to a place where I would not be, or my gender wouldn't be routinely questioned, and I was able to access that. And I appreciate, I recognize that's not something everyone can do, or everyone has, but I have it. I'll have that privilege. And so a lot of my experiences are informed not just by moving through the world as a trans woman, but by moving through someone who is largely presumed to be cis. I'm not saying nobody ever thought it, but the times I was ever confronted, or that someone alluded to the fact that I was trans, the last time that it happened to me where I could sense it was around 2004. So I have that privilege of being able to move through the world as a presumed cis person. The second thing is I'm a physician. I've been practicing for the last 23 years. I have a clinical practice. I'm a gastroenterologist. So I see people with stomach issues, bowel issues, those kind of things. Obviously, I think physicians are good people in general. I'm not saying every physician in the world is a good person, but I think the practice of medicine is an epidemic of society. I think not that doctors never make mistakes, but doctors are generally looking out for the patient's well-being. Doesn't mean they always get it right, but they're aiming to get it right. And so I think doctors are valuable. And so, like people throw around terms like transmedicalist, which I embrace partially. There are people sometimes have a very extreme definition of transmedicalism, which comes from like the 1980s and 90s. That's not what I'm about. But I do think that physicians have a role in helping people make the best decisions, and helping them provide the people with information and perspectives to help them make the best decisions of what's going to be best in their lives. And also are very aware of, at least from a medical perspective, of the potential benefits and harms that can go along with consequential interventions, and a considered transition to be a consequential intervention. I don't think that medication should be withheld because someone wants to live a different lifestyle than I do, or because someone has different sexual practices or different sexual orientations, or is queer than I am, or even that they won't necessarily, even because they're not going to be passable, or they want to live in an alternative lifestyle. That's not what I'm about. All I care about is this therapy actually making you better? Are you better for it than you were before? And am I potentially causing harm, both in terms of medical harms, because these medications are biologically active, and are there potential mental health and social harms that can be happen depending on your individual circumstance? I think those are important to be accounted for. And but I'm not someone who's like strict transmedicalist, like whatever Ken Zucker in the 1990s. Want to put a name on it. I do not believe that style of practice. The second is that I'm a scientist, so and particularly I'm an epidemiologist, which means I tend to look at things from the perspective of disease and trends, and how diseases move through populations. When I say disease, I'm using that as an epidemiologic term. I recognize that a lot of people don't consider being trans to be a disease, but I do consider having dysphoria, particularly if it's impacting on your quality of life, to be a disease, mental health disease. And generally, when people are diseased, we want to help them feel better.
Well,
and we also want to make sure. Yeah, go ahead.
When people hear the word disease, they think like something you can catch, or something that's going to like make you physically ill or something. But a disease is like, if you get into the definition of the word, it's anything that makes you not at ease, right? That's the whole definition of dis-ease.
So would you say that people with dysphoria are at ease?
No.
Hence.
Yeah.
So like, I recognize, like, we can, like, word games are a big part of the trans debate, no matter where you are. I'm just putting that out there as the epidemiologic definition, which correspond, is we track how condition, if you want to call it a condition, I can call it a condition for today, how conditions move through the population. What are the risk factors for developing them? What is their natural history? What are potential causes? What are aggravating factors, mitigating factors? How do treatments potentially impact on the course of that condition? Like that's how I look at things. And particularly my even though I'm not a gender medicine specialist, most of my research, and I've published about 250 or 260 papers at this point, have to do with how inflammatory bowel disease moves through the population. Where does it increase? Where does it decrease? How do medications impact on its course? What are the costs associated with that? Looking at doing cost effectiveness analyses, to look at comparative analyses on different treatments, try to find out which medications are the best in which situation. So that's kind of what I do. And so the reason I mention this is because I tend, when I look at conditions like why do people become dysphoric, or how do people respond to interventions, or what happens, what is the natural history of dysphoria over time, I look at it from that perspective, and that really informs a lot of why I come to certain conclusions, because that's my science.
Yeah.
The fourth thing, the last thing is, I'm not queer, and it doesn't mean that I don't respect queer people, but it just, like, I tend to look at things from a perspective of, I don't know, purity, which is kind of why a big motivation for my transition was that I did not want to be gender variant. I transitioned with the goal of doing the best I could to look at a queer female, and then just kind of blending in as any other woman.
Yeah.
And for a trans person, I've done pretty good. I'm not saying I've done perfectly, but it's been pretty good. And and I recognize not everyone fits the rules, but that was my goal. And it doesn't mean that I disrespect queer people, but I just don't have as much awareness of living a queer.
Can I ask, when you say queer people, are you talking strictly sexual orientation or like expression and stuff as well?
Gender expression is, gender nonconformingness.
Okay. Sure.
And
I get it.
But not even just sexual orientation, because I don't think not all gay and lesbian people identify as queer either.
Sure. No, I understand.
Yeah. So like that's where I'm coming from. And I'm not saying there's a judgment, because like I said, I know a lot of queer people, and I think they're fabulous, and not just capital F fabulous, but they're good people. But it's just not my perspective. It's not where I live my life. And so a lot of the queer politics I know about secondhand. It's not from direct experience. And also because of my privilege, I'm a little bit protected from a lot of the issues that people who are racially different, people who come from more impoverished backgrounds, people who don't have any support. I got really lucky in terms of the kind of things that came together for me. And it doesn't mean that I'm not aware of them, because like I'm a physician, I deal with people from all walks of life, like or everything in between, people of all backgrounds, people of all sexual orientations. And one of the things we try to do as a physician, even if you're not from those cultures or from those backgrounds, is you try to be culturally humble, and you try to be aware of situations that maybe you're unfamiliar with, but where you don't want to leave your patient in a place where they feel disrespected or uncomfortable in their presence. But it's not always perfect, because there's nothing that's quite the same as lived experience. And the last thing, is that I'm a parent. And that's probably my most important goal. So I've got 3 kids. One of them's all grown up. My other 2 are in adolescence right now. They are doing well. They're amazing kids. They're amazing kids. My husband and I, we're thankfully had the ability to access assistive technologies and familial health to bring these children into the world. It's a blessing that I cannot state highly enough. I know parenting isn't maybe everybody's dream, and maybe isn't everybody's reality, but it's something that was really important to my husband and I. And we were lucky enough to be able to make it happen. And our kids, I'm also fortunate that I can support, because I'm well off, I can support my kids in a lifestyle where they don't have to worry for, where the next meal is coming from. As best as we can try. We're still young, and identity formation is definitely a thing in adolescence. They appear to be so sexual. They appear to be straight, but we're open to the possibilities, because things can happen. But the reason I mentioned the parent is that parents will do anything for their children. Parents who care about their children will do anything for their children, and we are very protective about, especially in these days where we live in a rapidly changing world, the world that we're raising them into. And this does sort of inform a lot of my perspectives on trans issues. So I'm just I know that was quite a lot, but I think it's important to understand, when you understand where someone's coming from and why people think the way they do, why they might come to certain conclusions, even looking at the same data or the same situation that you or other guests might come to.
Right. No, I understand. I definitely agree that, I think a lot of people, especially on social media, if you're a trans activist, one of the big things that is popular to advocate for is the DIY HRT thing. And I find that often, while it is important to be able to access stuff like this that will, help you later on in the line, I think what a lot of people tend to gloss over is that there are, functional changes within your body that happen when you're replacing your hormones with a different hormone, right? Like, and I think it is important to, speak with a healthcare professional and talk about like what those changes are going to be, what you should expect, not just for your physical body, but also for your mental health, because there is a huge mental change, and people seem to be happy to celebrate the, I cried and at a pretty sunset or something, and it was so gender affirming and stuff like that. So they understand that there are mental changes, but like I feel like it's not like there are negative mental changes that come with it too, and those don't get talked about. So it is important to see, like, have somebody that you talk to on the regular, somebody that you can.
I'm a realist, and I recognize not everybody can see a doctor, especially if you're in, I think you're in the States.
Yeah.
You're in the States? Yeah. Like
I'm in Colorado. Canada, yeah. No, it's super nice here.
That's a state.
Yeah.
Yeah. But so it's nice in Colorado, but we all know that there are places where healthcare, particularly gender related care, is difficult to access.
Mm-hmm.
We know that wait lists can be long. We know that not everybody has the money or the insurance to see a doctor. Medicare or Medicaid may not be covered depending on where you live. So I see DIY as sort of a necessary. I'm not going to say evil because I don't think it's evil, but it's sort of like I recognize that there are going to be people who go DIY,
right?
Because of the deficits in the system, and my solution to that would be, let's try to improve the system so people don't have to go DIY. But I recognize that people will, and I'm not looking to like chase people down who are DIYing and get off your horn. Like, I recognize, but at the same time, I think there's still a role, even if for those people who are DIYing, even if they can't see a doctor, to have the best information out there, so that they can still make the most informed decisions about what is happening. And we also have to recognize that we are living in a data environment where we all have theories about what's likely true, but we don't really know what's true. And we also tend to lean into our own experiences. So if I just look no farther than the tip of my nose, I would say that there's no reason why anyone shouldn't transition. This has been the most positive, I'm only 26 years out now. I'll be 26 years out this fall. This has been the most positive, unquestionably correct decision that I've made in my life.
Yeah.
Nothing can compare to finally arriving at the wisdom to make this decision. And if I looked no farther than the end of my nose, I'd be like, everybody should do this. I want everybody to be as happy, to feel the fulfillment, the flourishing that I've had. Now, that doesn't, because I do try to look hard in the tip of my own nose, I know that that is not necessarily going to be the case for everybody who feels the drive to transition. And it may be that it's just not a good decision overall. It may be bad timing. It may be that they don't have the support they need that to help them navigate a transition. People could have complexifying factors like other physical health issues, mental health issues. That doesn't mean that they're not trans. That just means that navigating a transition becomes more fraught and more challenging. And if you're already someone who might struggle with resilience, that might make something that would be a positive experience or a neutral experience for someone else a very negative experience. These are the kind of things that people be aware of. And I think having that information out there, so people aren't going in all with Pollyanna. The transition, I recognize that a lot of trans people do their research, in a sense, that they really, at the time they made that decision, they've looked at everything. They've looked at tons of papers. They've looked at, everybody's blogs, everybody's YouTube videos. They've spoken to like friends, like in my days, because I was contemplating in the late 90s, it was like looking at people's studies pages and reaching out to people who looked at all that. Trying to be like, is this really possible? Is this fake? Is this real? That's that was sort of like how I came to it. So I recognize that a lot of people are very thoughtful and very meticulous and very, have good executive function, but that's not everybody. And I'm not saying that people who lack these skills are bad people or that they shouldn't transition at all, but it's just that it's going to pose different challenges. And if you don't face those challenges well, it's going to lead to struggles that could have been avoided.
Yeah. Oh, well, I appreciate you adding the context that you needed to. It
Yeah,
definitely helps prime everyone for the rest of this. I did have a question for you though. Um, on your podcast, when you're speaking with your co-host about things, I
yeah,
find that we tend to see represented more like a conservative viewpoint, for lack of a better way of putting this. I don't want to say like turf or anything like that. I don't want to be disparaging by any means, but we certainly see like the anti-trans quote unquote perspective represented. We have a more kind of moderate centrist position in your argumentations, and I often feel that the other side of things is um, not as well represented. I wanted to ask specifically about the conversation you had with Maya Poet.
yeah.
Is that something that maybe your co-host had wanted to do, or
You
I
know, we
just
we talk about our guests together. Often one of us will come with a suggestion of someone we want to bring on, and I'm generally pretty open as long as they follow sort of the basic rules, which is
sure,
that that we're respectful to each other. We don't misgender each other. Like
yeah,
we don't call each other names. We don't assume bad impulses. And so I will talk to someone, even people who I profoundly disagree with, even people who I think are doing bad things in the world,
yeah,
um, because I think I'd rather provide some voice from outside their echo chamber.
hmm
Um, that they're not like, if you look at where someone like Maya Poet is usually interviewed, it's not by trans people. It's by, this whole gender critical social media infrastructure that gets sort of passed around, where people sort of pass between all these different, chirpy posts, and they all say the same story, and nothing gets questioned, nothing gets challenged. Um, at the same time, I wouldn't call it conservative, but it's definitely it's informed by my values. And I would describe myself as a conservative person, I'm a pragmatic person. Is probably the word I use most to describe myself, which is like
okay, yeah, I like
what's true
pragmatic,
and
yeah,
what is the best way to get there? Like what actually works,
yeah,
as opposed to like what would be the ideal situation? Because often, we can all have our perfect world that we're trying to build, but recognize that there's challenges with interpreting it. And I tend to work in a world of the is more than world of the should. Like I can use the should as here's where I want to get to, but the is sort of here's what I can actually do right now.
mm,
Um, and my political perspective, like if you take a look at like outside of trans issues, like the policy for I'm actually fairly progressive. Like I support universal basic income. I support Medicare for all. I'm a
hmm
peacenik. I favor, I live in a country that's more socialist. I think it should be even more socialist.
hmm
I think, I believe in community. I don't believe in wealth hoarding. So like a lot of my positions are, you know, just in terms of like for prevalences, like there's very, like I've never voted like for the conservative parties here in Canada in my life. I do vote depending on who's running for the progressive or the more sort of centrist liberal, party. Um, and
sure,
but I think what you're actually getting at is what you're saying is pragmatism. It's not conservatism. Um, what I'm looking at is I'm looking at there's something going on, and I'm trying to figure out from a scientific perspective what are the possible hypotheses, because we've had this sort of fairly dogmatic belief in terms of like why people become trans and what is the natural history of being trans and what is the benefits and drawbacks of transition that are based both on our own experiences and certainly my own experience of someone who was dysphoric from like a very young age, who uh, you know had a successful transition uh, to a very different era today where we're living in a very different world than I grew up in, and also in a very different world than I transitioned in. There are definite trends that are, I don't think so alarming, but they're from an epidemiologic perspective, like from a science perspective, if I had seen these kind of trends with any other disease, This would be like, let's get on this. Let's figure out what's going on here because this is weird. If we were talking about whatever, a GI condition or a cancer or a heart disease or whatever, like if you saw like all of a sudden there's tons of women developing this condition that weren't before, and that it's and that the rates of this are going up, the rates of people coming with symptoms of this condition are going up by 5x, 10x times, and that people are being put on a therapy that is consequential. You'd be like, hey, we need to kind of figure out why this is happening, what's going on, because I want to make sure we're doing best by our patients. That's science. It's not, and when you're presented with sort of an epidemiology with a set of sort of, let's say, trends or a set of associations, one of the things we try to do is figure out like what are the most likely or what are the potential explanations? Like, are there multiple explanations? How would we test those hypotheses to see are they like more likely to be true, less likely to be true? How do we work in an environment where the data is actually often quite messy, like where we're often getting our information from personal perspectives, which carry with it their own biases from incomplete data sources, from where data comes, it might be years down the line, but very hard to assess. So we recognize living in a world where data is often imperfect. And I try to look at this not from the like, oh, I want the trans side to win, or I want the transition side to win, or I want the anti-transition side to win. I'm like, okay, how do we figure out who are the people that benefit the most from this intervention? Who are the people that would benefit from waiting? Who are the people that would not benefit from this intervention? Who would be the people to be harmed? What are the potential underlying factors that might predict who those people are? How would we design a study to assess that? And what hypotheses, based on whatever preliminary data is coming in, seem more compelling? Like, or why do certain theories seem less compelling than others? Like, I try to look at it not from like I want everyone, like I want the trans side to win, but just like I want the truth to win.
Well, how compelling do you find the social contagion narrative?
So I don't call it social contagion. I think there's an element of that, but I think when people say social contagion, that's really shorthand for a lot of different things. The words I use, which are part of, once again, purely epidemiological, is that there is likely an emergent cause of exposures. Meaning that there is something in the environment. It doesn't mean like what you breathe or what you drink within your water or your food, but just something that's not genetic that people are acquiring that is predisposing people who have a predisposition to dysphoria to getting dysphoria, to getting clinical dysphoria earlier and more and at higher levels than would have happened in the absence of that exposure. Now, the big question, of course, is well, what is that exposure? And
it's got to be multifaceted, right? I mean, like
it's well, that's the only thing. It probably is multifaceted because I'm not going to also deny. Like when I say that, I'm not saying it's all social contagion because absolutely, we live in an environment where there's more awareness, there's more supply of physicians, there's more awareness among physicians that this is a thing. There are incentives in a lot of places for physicians to treat this condition. So there's a lot of other reasons why people who are genuinely dysphoric, who would have been dysphoric in the 70s and the 90s and the 2010s, to get care earlier and to recognize their condition earlier, and for whatever, even their parents to be like more receptive. When I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, this was not something that I went to my parents with.
Right.
In the 2020s, it may be. I'm not saying every parent, but it may be. There was no interventions when I was growing up. There are now. And so I recognize that that's also going on, that people, like I always say that if I was born in 1972, so I'm 54 years old. If I had been born in 1982 or 1992, there's no way I would have made it 27 without transitioning. Like, I know that.
Yeah.
Like, I would have had that information in my possession probably by age 10, 11.
Right.
And I would have seen other people doing this by age 10, 11, and I'd be like, that's fucking me. Like, like I wouldn't have, tried to tough this out as a young adult and be like, oh, I can't do this, can't do this, can't do this. So obviously that is a factor as well. So when I say that I believe that there are exposures, I'm not trying to deny that there's no other factors. The question is, if it was just, like, people put up like left-handedness graph and things like that. I said, if this was just increased awareness, earlier diagnoses, people feeling more free to share the fact that they're dysphoric with people who can direct them to care. But why is it happening in a pattern that it is? Like, this is a thing that's very difficult, I think, to explain. which is like, why is it affecting? And this is something that's consistently seen around the world. Why is it affecting young women more than young men? Do we really believe that the natural levels of gender dysphoria in the population are 3 or 4 times higher in young women than in young men? Like, maybe, but it seems unlikely.
When you say 3 or 4 times higher in women than men,
Because
you're talking about cis women versus cis men.
No, I'm talking about people, the rate of young people who are self-identifying as trans and non-binary, and I'm talking about the proportion of people who actually present to clinics seeking care, gender dysphoria, not necessarily going on hormones, but seeking care.
Okay.
And if you look at any gender clinic, any adolescent gender clinic or young adult gender clinic around the world, or at least around the adult world, whether you're looking in Canada, whether you're looking in the US, whether you're looking, different places in Europe, in Australia and New Zealand, this trend is consistent. But the numbers might be slightly different from place to place, but the trend is consistent. There's also an increase, the types of people who are coming in. If you look at the nature of the women, of the young women, or the potential trans men who are coming in, they're more likely to have complexifying factors, things that make their transitions potentially more challenging. And I'm not saying, once again, these things are not trans, but if you suffer from chronic anxiety and depression, if you have a history of adverse childhood experiences, if you have a personality, let's say disorder, but a personality that makes it difficult to manage external stresses, if you have, if you're neurotypical, these are complexifying in the sense that they make, not that they necessarily mean that you're not really trans, you're just autistic, or you're just this. It just means that, it just means that if you do transition, it might impact on your likelihood of success. I'm not saying it does. I'm just saying you have to consider that anytime you have it, like this is true in any condition. Like if you have heart disease, but you also have lung disease and kidney disease, your heart disease becomes harder to treat. It doesn't mean we don't treat the heart disease, but it's recognizing that diagnosis may not be as good, or there might be reasons why you can't do something that you would have done in some who didn't. It's conditions.
Well, I got that talk when I started my transition, because I'm predisposed to, high anxiety and depression. Sure. And, my physician said, well, undergoing this therapy can sometimes worsen those rather than alleviating them as you might think. And in some ways, they were a lot more intense after the fact.
And I can say, if you have good supports or you have good self-awareness, maybe you power through that. So I'm not saying just because someone's autistic, they shouldn't transition. I'm just saying it makes your transitions more challenging. Right. It might affect the likelihood of getting an efficacious response, or the likelihood of sticking it out, or the likelihood of feeling regret. Now, the regret issue is also very complicated because we do not have good numbers on regret.
Well, I understand that the regret rate for trans men is higher than for trans women.
We don't know. We suspect it is, but we actually don't have hard numbers on it. The reason we suspect it's higher is that whenever you do a detransition study, and recognizing there's always going to be selection biases, there's kind of people who want to participate in these kind of studies and people who are less likely to participate, if they're asked to participate in a survey or get an invitation. But it's very consistent that three things, I should say, that natal females predominate among detransitioners, at least in these studies, as imperfect as they are. The second is that the people who detransition tend to have higher burdens of a lot of complexifying factors that we talked about before. And the third is that when you look at regret scores, that natal females who detransition are much more likely to frame it in terms of regret. Now, a lot of the study comes from McKinnon, who's done kind of a larger study. There's other smaller studies, but there's nothing that really contradicts. Is that when girls detransition, they're not detransitioning as often because of, let's say, external hard trips. People weren't accepting me. I wasn't, I lost my job. I'm economically disadvantaged. I lost my family support. I just need to do this as a practical. I need to have a practical detransition because I just can't make it. I can't support myself in this role. And if I go back to living as a girl, or I go back to living as a boy, then I can move back to my family, and those kind of things that are very real.
Right.
But women are much more likely to be like, no, this was a mistake. I shouldn't have done this. This was a long call. The doctor should stop me. Someone should have paid more attention to me. And a lot of this could be post hoc reframing, like they could have had a bad experience and now they're looking for people to blame. Like I get that, but they are more likely to frame your transitions in that way, and they're also much less likely to retransition. Like they're done.
There's a certain one that's coming to mind right now.
Anyway. We don't know how many, because of course there's an incentive for Elon to amplify their stories, and there's this whole network of amplifying of an amplifying media sphere that tends to, make it seem like they're everywhere, even though like the numbers might actually be quite small. But if I were, but I'm saying, if you were a clinician today, if you were a pediatric clinician, you have to at least be mindful that there's something going on, even if you can't quantify it precisely. And you would probably be on very shaky ground if you didn't bring up the risk of detransition, even if you couldn't put a precise number on it, to anyone who's seeking transition, because if they did decide at a later date that, say, this wasn't for me, you would be on very shaky ground. Because people would say, hey, come on, you know this was in the atmosphere, even if you didn't know the numbers, you knew this was happening. It would be, like, and I've spoken to pediatric clinicians, and they're wary. Like even in Canada, where it's kind of open, like it's still, they're wary. Like they've started to change the practice and be a little more circumspect about their how they manage patients, and especially patients who come in with supplying factors. Which I'm not saying it's everybody, but it's a lot of them. And in terms of like what are the kind of supports that this person is really going to need, in order to maximize the likelihood of successful transition, what are the kind of things we have to watch out for? Like, how do we deal with transition anxiety? Like, someone's thinking, maybe I do want to do transition, maybe this isn't right for me. Like, how do we manage people who are having doubts along the way? Like, these are things that clinicians nowadays are dealing with, because they probably didn't pick up on the past, and they're facing, obviously in the States and even in other parts of the world, a lot of consequences for kind of being late to recognize or late on these epidemiologic phenomena.
Well, one last thing I wanted to ask you. Really quickly, going back to your conversation with Maya. I understand generally what your co-host might have gotten out of that conversation. From your perspective, from your position, what do you feel you gained from that conversation with her?
I think it's really important to hear people's stories, even if they've had an experience that's different, even if their political position is not what you want it to be. I think it's important to understand how people get to those positions. Like what was the pathway that led to my approach, being my approach. While also recognizing that someone like my approach today is not the my approach was a year ago. And how do you also put her in a place where she is hearing other people's perspectives? As someone who's probably, I'm not saying a ton of influence, but has a platform. How do you get her to hear a little bit of the other side, or on what some of the negative consequences of her, let's say, advocacy are? And one of the things about Maya, I'm not saying, like I said, I think she's doing a lot of things that I wish she wasn't doing. Like I said, I think GenSpect is a malignant force. Like, I can't just bring her on and say, hey, you need to stop associating with GenSpect. But I can, and that as part of the conversation, be like, hey, like, I know what you think these people are standing for, but here's how it feels on our side. At the same time, I really want to understand, like, why someone like Maya, how did someone like Maya get into transition? How did someone like Maya find that this was a regret for her? And for a number of reasons. One is, like, obviously, I think it's important. Like, I think if we want to save trans healthcare, we have to do a better job. Sure, we don't transition lives. Like, I'm not saying genetically transition, but that we don't let someone sit with this notion that they are that they are trans. Sorry. Hold on 1 second.
Yeah.
Um, you know, I don't think we're doing. I don't think we're doing a service for trans people who need this care if we are uncritically in what we're doing and we're not cautious about over-treating people who are going to regretfully detransition. Uh, because I think there are people who are getting treated who probably did not benefit and who, given what we know now, may not have been, may have been guided down other alternate pathways that would have been better for them. I think we really want to make sure the people who get the care are the people who are most likely to benefit from the care, who are going to, and to support them in ways that maximize the likelihood of success of their transitions.
Mhm.
Like this detransition narrative, regardless of how big it is, you know, is incredibly damaging to the notion that physicians are providing high quality care to dysphoric, the people who have dysphoria. And it does probably require some open mindedness about, well, what is actually going on here? Like maybe it's not all innate and immutable. Like obviously, there's people who are detransitioning and not identifying as trans, and not just because it's inconvenient, just because the adapters don't think it was a mistake. And I think we need to do a better job of finding those people or guiding them out of transition and recognizing it earlier in the transitions. And I recognize, like I said, I know my vote did medically transition. Um, but other people do. The other reason is I like letting people tell their stories and putting it in front of an audience and let the audience kind of pick out, like, does the story really make sense? Like,
Sure.
I'm not there to sort of question. I'm not, whatever. Like the one I can't remember their names now. Like we're doing Bernstein. Like that's not my job. My job is to have a conversation,
Mhm.
let people tell their stories, and if that story is compelling to you, great. If you find that story inconsistent, or you find that story kind of discursive, or you find that story not like if you think it's a lie, or or prompts you to maybe do your own digging and say, hey, there's something she said that didn't really make a lot of sense that she's kind of dining on.
Mhm.
Um, Go and do that. Like let people tell their story. And what I find is that the more time you get people to talk a lot of times, obviously if their story is true, it becomes more and more compelling. If their story is inconsistent or their story is, seems like bleeding out important details, it's going to be overturned over time too. So, those are my sort of motivations. Like when I bring on people who are more gender critical, it's all of those things. It's not just like I want to give
Mm.
this person a platform because there's lots of places they can get platforms. Most people have platforms bigger than I do. But I said, it's often the first time that anyone even, you know, who's both transportive, but coming at it from like a assault, like not trying to overstate the case and actually confirming them on why they believe what they believe. And, and on things that they're overlooking, or on being, let's say, a lot of people's experience with trans people, which is what we see online. They don't know real life trans people. Actually talking to someone like me who kind of, for better or for worse, vibes reasonably well, like it throws them, because they don't see that often. And and what I'm hoping is that even if they don't change right away, that they walk out of that conversation like I planted a seed somewhere deep in their brain.
Yeah.
And
Well,
maybe over time they change because they had a conversation where someone kind of listened to them and took them seriously, but also kind of pushed back on some of the stronger points.
mhm. You know, many would say that Maya has
Yeah.
been dishonest about her experience in order to enrich herself. With that in mind, did you have any reservations about speaking with her? Did you think perhaps she might be dishonest with you in your conversation?
Like I said, my job is not so much because I'm not there to question people's motives directly. Uh, like if someone says something in, of course, that story that's contradictory, um, I'll pick up and say, hey, you kind of said this, like what's going on there. But I'm not bringing people on to ambush them and be like, well, you said this and this, like I think there's other podcasts that can do that. And I also think if I do that too much, I'm not going to have a podcast. And because I have a larger goal, like it's not like my goal isn't to be like by all means, like let the domain take on my poet and carve her up. Like, that's fabulous. Like when she does things like that. Like if she wants to, if she feels that this person is being actually dishonest or is drifting on our story. I think like, people are complicated. I think Maya's got some sincerity in the sense that she really believes she had a bad experience and that she doesn't think transition benefits people. And since we'd be better off if we, restricted it, more significantly, that's her position. I think she's come by that honestly. But I think every element of her story is like, did it necessarily all ring true? Like there's certainly some things where I'm kind of like, that sounds a little off. And if I was a different kind of podcast, I could, do the investigative work to figure out, on this time she said this and this time she said that, and the timeline doesn't line up and all, like someone can do there's people who do that better than I do. Like I've told you what my background is.
Yeah.
And if someone wants to take on like the My Poet story and carve it to shreds, like by all means, like, shred that. It's just
so it wasn't a concern of yours whether she was going to be honest or dishonest. It was just
not really, because like she tells her story in 100 different places, and that's not the purpose of the podcast. Like it is, and like I said, I'm a physician, so I'm kind of a skeptical person. So I feel like not just my poet. There's a lot of people who tell me their stories, or I'm kind of talking about, where I've got a theoretically arched eyebrow about portions of their story that just don't, that lack their similitude. That maybe are true, but seem a little outlandish. But like sometimes outlandish things are true. But like my goal is more. The purpose of the podcast, like I said, is not to, be like over you at 2 p.m. on, that's not the purpose. And like I said, I'm there to question people about their positions, and not as much their narratives, unless there's obvious holes that are conducive to the point I'm trying to make.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
I understand more.
Anyways.
Now, one last thing I just want to ask: how do you pronounce your last name? Is it Targownik?
Yeah. So, how do you pronounce it, or how do I pronounce it? The question. It's a challenging Slavic name, but it looks more challenging than it is. But technically, it's Targownik. I go by Targownik. I just go by Dr. Laura because that's easier. Most of my patients just call me Dr. Laura. But yeah, it's Targownik. But if you say Targownik or that's fine.
Okay.
I know who you're looking for.
Yeah, no, I just see it's mentioned a lot in the article. I just want to get that right when I'm reading.
Yeah, so go read the article. And like I said, like I said, I know I've had a chance here for an hour and a half to sort of state my position. I thank you for the privilege of that. But
yeah, thanks for coming on. It was a pleasure.
I want you and I want whoever's listening to look at this and the rigmarole around it, but a critical eye, and people can come to their own conclusions about who they think's in the right or who's making their points, and I said, like that's fair. Like I said, I'm just gonna say this is one last thing. Like I do not think our community benefits when we're going after each other.
I highly recommend you look at the other piece that I read prior to our conversation, because it dives a lot into that.
I didn't read the article, but I caught a little bit of the narrative. Tara, I think Tara sounds like a brilliant writer and a brilliant thinker. And like obviously her life is different than mine, but like they're definitely poignant. That's a very poignant story. But you're right. Like I think a lot of us do live with a lot of hurt, and we often express that hurt in maladaptive ways. Like I said, I try to feel like I said, there's a lot of people who I find irritating and annoying who have a position that I just think is really not right, or just the mode of communication is more antagonistic or inflammatory. And I usually just let it be, because I'm, like I said, it doesn't benefit to fight in front of the troops. Like, like I've got enough troops attacking me. I don't, like to have people in our community just gives, like let the tourists watch this, like watch a tranny fight. That doesn't help anybody. Like people are going to disagree. People are going to think other people are wrong. I think there's a way to handle it like adults, and there's a way to handle it like children. Even if they're particularly well written. I don't think this really benefits like people have no motivations. If she feels better for having done this, or feels vindicated or a sense of righteousness. Like people have their own motivations, like that's fine. Objectively, I just don't think it's very helpful.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it was brilliant talking to you. I always appreciate you sharing your perspectives.
Yeah, and like I said, I recognize that the podcast is to be, I don't think we're still in the trigger warning era, but I recognize that the things we talk about are challenging, and I know both people who are, to read the comments, a lot of people who are gender critical disagree with me, and personally people who are more trans supportive disagree. But like I said, I try to do it from a honest place. I'm not trying to do it. Like I said, my goal, and I think this is a shared goal among most trans people, is I want every person who benefits from transition to get access to transition. I want every person who transitions to have a good life. That's my goal.
Okay, that seems fair.
And like I said, and I might think there's a different way of going about this than other people, but it doesn't mean that we don't share the same things.
Yeah, I agree.
All right. Okay. Thank you very much. Have a great afternoon.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. Have a good one.
Okay, bye-bye.
Okay, friends. That was a brilliant conversation. I always love hearing the perspectives of others, especially, not disparagingly by any means, but those are elders. You know what I mean? Like people who have been around for longer and people who have been transitioning for longer. I started really recently, just like 5 years ago. So I had access to a lot more resources that people like Dr. Laura didn't. So it's always a pleasure getting to hear the perspectives of people who have been doing this a lot longer and with a lot more fight than I have had to put up in my transition. So give me just a moment. I'm going to go fetch another Red Bull from the fridge, and then we will be back to dive into this piece. So I'll be right back. Well, hey, Haku. How's it going, buddy? Hi, Flame. Thanks for stopping by, everyone. I know it's boring politics day, but it's nice to hear from you nonetheless. Okay. Targownik, I think, is what she said, is how her name is pronounced. The W is pronounced like a V, like in German, I think, does that. Getting ready for vacation. Nice. I told Stream this earlier, but I'm going to be splitting this stream up into 3 different videos for each topic that we're discussing today. I highly recommend you check out the first one because it's very poignant. Especially if you have any kind of perspectives from like a trans community or anything like that. Just the kind of shit that we put ourselves through for the sake of putting ourselves through it. Anyway, let's get into this. Targownik, Trans Validator, from the same networks that brought you Research Validator by SEGM and Journalistic Validator by Hazard Ratio. I don't know any of these pieces, but okay. So we had Dr. Laura on earlier to provide her perspectives and a little context for this. She did mention to me privately that they go a little bit into like her censure that happened a number of years ago As I understand it, it's completely unrelated to any of like her research, and is really just like the way she put it, it was like a feud between two people that got a little heated on her end, and she regrets it. And the organization that she was with at the time they had been seeing a lot of this kind of thing, and they wanted to make an example out of this. And so they used her as kind of an extreme example of how this behavior would be treated going forward. And yeah, so there's a lot of context there that, again, I haven't seen those criticisms in this piece yet. I haven't had the opportunity to read this piece. I was going to do this on stream, but just wanted to, again, remind everyone of that context before we get diving in. The Curious Case of Laura Targownik. There's a curious form of intellectual dishonesty that reveals itself not in what someone says, but in the distance between what they have said and what they are doing. It is the dishonesty of someone who knows better, but has decided that knowing better does not serve their interests. The sort of thing we tell ourselves in order to convince ourselves, as much as our conservative family and friends, that we are not, quote, that kind of gay, or one of those trans. We are the reasonable ones, the ones who do understand, the ones who can be trusted. And in that reassurance lies a small compromise, then another, until the distance between what we know and what we are doing becomes a chasm we have stopped examining. Within this philosophical musing lies the article which examines Dr. Laura Targownik's recent work on gender-affirming medical care. Dr. Laura is a gastroenterologist and an epidemiologist at the University of Toronto. She completed medical school in 1997, transitioned in 2000, and has built a 26-year career in digestive disease research. Her published work, over 450 peer-reviewed articles, focuses on inflammatory bowel disease and healthcare utilization. She has no published research on gender-affirming medical care, no clinical work on transgender youth, or with transgender youth, and no formal training in gender medicine. She writes a blog hosted on Substack called The Data-Driven Transsexual, and co-hosts a podcast on YouTube called Agree to Disagree About Gender with Yvette Nari, a, quote, gender-critical activist, where they platform and interview almost exclusively folks critical of various aspects surrounding trans healthcare or hold anti-trans views. She's quite the active Twitter user. Targownik self-describes as a, quote, binary assimilationist transsexual, a pragmatic progressive, and a transmedicalist. She has become increasingly involved publicly in trans politics since Trump's election in 2024. In June 2026, she published What Oregon Can Teach Canada About Pediatric Gender Medicine. This article recommends psychotherapy as first-line treatment, raises concerns about rising prevalence among AFAB youth, emphasizes the irreversibility of testosterone, and frames informed consent models with skepticism. What follows is an in-depth examination of that article, the evidence it cites, and what that evidence actually shows, and what patterns emerge when we look carefully at how she has presented her case. Now, we talked a little bit about this preceding the article, this specifically about the prevalence in gender dysphoria, specifically in AFAB youth, where we often find that regret rates are higher. I believe Dr. Laura said 3 times higher in trans men than can be found in trans women. And that's a significant number. There hasn't, as far as she's put it, there hasn't been a whole lot of research done into like the motivations of detransitioners, but if you walk into any gender clinic and you talk with the doctors there, you're likely to find that people who come in for detransition care are often assigned female at birth or natal females, and that they often have complicating factors in addition that would make their transition difficult. It's I believe Dr. Laura said it's more common for trans men to come in for detransition care over just like this isn't working for me, this was a mistake, I can't do it, rather than you know, I lost my job, I lost my friends, I lost my family, I lost my house. I'm going back because it's more practical for me. I can't live like that. Trans men come in because it's just simply a regret for them. And I think it is important to analyze what's causing that and why there is such a stark difference. If there were no difference, you wouldn't see these numbers that are so different between the two different communities, because it is fundamentally the same type of care. You have a problem in gender dysphoria and you treat it with gender transition, and that's how things have been known for as long as we have been known. But I digress. Let's continue. See what this person has to say. What follows is an in-depth examination of that article, the evidence it cites, blah, blah, blah. I already read that paragraph. Follow the academic citations. Targownik cites researcher Kinnan McKinnon's... What a funny name, Kinnan McKinnon. Wow. I'm going to see them on Celebrity Deathmatch, right? The claymation thing on MTV. Anybody? Anybody? No? Just me? Am I a boomer? Targownik cites researcher Kinnan McKinnon's work on detransition, writing that McKinnon has, quote, suggested as an informed estimate rather than a settled empirical finding that 5 to 10% of this cohort may eventually detransition in adulthood. This framing is misleading on multiple counts. To understand why, we need to trace what McKinnon is actually citing. Early studies from the 1970s until the 2000s suggested detransition among adults was rare. About 1 to 6% reversed the process or expressed regret, but some recent studies among young people have suggested it could now be higher, 5 to 10%, an increase that has come amid a sharp rise in the number of young people seeking care at gender clinics. This is from McKinnon's Substack article, The Truth About Detransitioning, which was originally published online in the New York Times on August 10th, 2025. My son almost had the same first, middle, and last name with an S added. That would have been something. That would have been fucking great. He would have been the main character. The main character of the whole world. The Boyd Hackett Bewley audit. So wait, hang on. The framing is misleading. Oh, okay. So we actually are diving into the... Okay. I thought it just ended here and we went to the next section. Never mind. McKinnon's detransition estimates are drawn from two primary sources. The first is a UK primary care audit by Boyd, Hackett, and Bewley, published in 2022. This study examined 68 patients identified as trans or gender diverse from a single GP practice in a remote part of Britain. 0.34% of that practice's total patient population. Of those 68 patients, only 41 had received hormone treatment. And of those 41, the study identified 4 with notes referencing detransition or a change in gender identity, yielding a 9.8 detransition rate. But read the study's own limitations. The researchers acknowledged that 29% of their identified patients had not yet been referred to a gender identity clinic. Without contacting these patients, they could not determine if they were pursuing transition or not. They note their small sample size from a single remote practice limits what we can confidently conclude applies elsewhere, including the detransition rate. They performed no statistical significance testing. This was a quality improvement audit conducted at one primary care practice, not a population epidemiological study. The methodology itself precludes drawing broad conclusions. What McKinnon does not disclose, and what Targownik certainly does not, is that 2 of 3 authors of this methodologically limited study are embedded in anti-transgender activist organizations. Susan Bewley is an obstetrician and longtime anti-transgender activist who has published papers critical of trans healthcare terminology and protocols, speaks at anti-trans conferences organized by Society for Evidence-Based Gender Medicine, aka SEGM, a known anti-trans hate group, and collaborates with organizations explicitly opposed to gender-affirming care. Thomas Hackett and Isabel Boyd are listed as affiliates of the D-Trans Foundation, an ex-trans foundation with similar underpinnings as the ex-gay movement. The study that McKinnon cites for his detransition prevalence estimates was authored by anti-trans activists embedded in organizations dedicated to restricting gender-affirming care. Furthermore, we need to keep these numbers in perspective, as the study concerns 4 individuals in one primary care practice in a remote part of Britain. This is the sample size from which a 9.8 detransition rate is derived, and what appears to be the figure that anchors the upper bound of McKinnon's 5 to 10% estimate, which Targownik presents as an informed estimate. The Oslo misconduct finding. The second source McKinnon cites is research by Anne Ware and colleagues. In June 2026, contemporaneous with Targownik's June article, the Integrity Committee of the University of Oslo, Oslo University Hospital, and Akershus, I don't know how to pronounce that, but I'm giving it my best shot, University Hospital found where Trond H. Disseth and Cecile... Why do they have to have these names, bruh? Cecile Bejertness. Bejertness. No. Cecile Bejertness Nyquist, guilty of research misconduct. The committee determined that they had committed, quote, serious violations of recognized research ethics standards that were grossly negligent and constituted scientific misconduct. The committee recommended 2 of their published articles be retracted and others be referred to the Norwegian Office of the Ombudsman for further investigation. Targownik does not mention that one of her key sources, research cited by McKinnon to establish detransition prevalence, was found guilty of research misconduct, or that the associated papers have been referred for further investigation. The Ware study, despite its serious ethical violations, actually undercuts the high detransition narrative. Its data shows detransition is rare. The ethical violation, accessing data without consent, is real and serious, but it doesn't make the detransition rate higher or lower. If anything, the study's acknowledged underestimation problem means the real rate could be somewhat higher than 2.3%, but the Boyd audit's 9.8% is still the outlier driving McKinnon's upper bound. Targownik doesn't disclose either of these points. McKinnon's 2 sources actually shows detransition is uncommon, meaning the 5 to 10% estimate is being pulled upward almost entirely by a 4-person subsample from a single remote GP practice staffed by anti-trans activists. Crazy! McKinnon's warnings omitted. When Targownik describes McKinnon's detransition figures as his informed estimate rather than a settled empirical finding, she's burying several critical facts. McKinnon is not generating his own estimates. He's citing a quality improvement audit from a single remote primary care practice with a sample of 41 hormone-treated patients, authored by anti-trans activists, and research by authors found guilty of research misconduct. He's speculating that the true detransition rate is, quote, probably higher based on these compromised sources. Targownik presents this cascade of methodological weakness, ideological positioning, based on the authors of the paper, and to a lesser degree, McKinnon's own position, and ethical violation, as though it constitutes reliable epidemiological data. Moreover, Targownik omits McKinnon's explicit warnings about how this research should be used. In the same article where he discusses detransition figures, McKinnon writes with absolute, quote, clarity, "Nothing in my team's research or any other studies on detransition should lead to the conclusion that policymakers ought to issue blanket bans on gender-affirming care, or that healthcare providers should ever try to change a person's gender identity or expression by engaging in so-called conversion therapy." He goes on further to warn that restrictions on gender-affirming care have also caused many people to stop or reverse their desired transitions, creating the type of involuntary detransition found in my own research. He is unambiguous. He is warning against exactly what Targownik does. McKinnon further states, the Trump administration's rhetoric on detransition is dangerously myopic. We've found that many people detransition not out of regret, but because they feel forced to by societal factors like negative attitudes toward transgender people. As we see in his quote above from his article, he documents that restrictive policies themselves create involuntary detransitions. People stop or reverse transition not because they were wrong to transition, but because social hostility made continuing unsustainable. He's saying using detransition data to justify restrictions does not just fail logically, it creates the harm it claims to prevent. Yet, Targownik uses McKinnon's speculative interpretation of activist-authored audit research and research found guilty of misconduct to argue for more psychotherapy, more assessment, more caution. This is effectively restricting access. She cites a researcher's citation of methodologically weak and ethically compromised research while completely omitting his I will get this out. His explicit warnings about their misuse. She extracts numbers while leaving behind the researcher's repeated insistence that these numbers should not justify what she is advocating. This is not an innocent oversight. This is selective citation deployed to contradict the researcher's stated position while obscuring the methodological, ideological, and ethical foundations of the claims themselves. For the record, based on a 2025 longitudinal study of 377 trans youth, the detransition rate was about 2.5%. For surgical regret, the data shows an even lower rate. A 2021 analysis found that in 27 studies totaling 7,928 surgery patients, the pooled regret rate was about 1%. Ooh, we're getting spicy. We're getting spicy today, chat. We're getting so spicy. The rhetoric on anything should be thrown out the window. You know? What was it they say? Live and let live. Is that what they say? I think that's how it goes. Targownik begins her article with a striking claim. There has also been a profound rise in the number of young Canadians referred for care to Canadian gender clinics, and this rise is being driven primarily by natal females who comprise up to 80% of young people presenting for care. Compared with earlier transition cohorts, these adolescents tend to have shorter histories of apparent gender incongruent behaviors, higher rates of psychological comorbidity and neurodiversity, more personality disorder traits, and more frequent histories of adverse childhood experiences. She provides no citations for any of these claims, but they bear a striking resemblance and alignment to another problematic hypothesis and dataset. The Lippmann Trail. Beep, 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 beep. The 80% figure appears to come from Lisa Lippmann's 2018 Rapid Onset Gender Dysphoria, or ROGD, study. Lippmann surveyed 256 patients from 3 anti-transgender websites, Fourth Wave Now, Transgender Trend, Youth Trans Critical Professionals, and found that 82.8% of the youth described were assigned female at birth. The accompanying claims about shorter histories, higher rates of psychological comorbidity and neurodiversity, more personality disorder traits, and more frequent histories of adverse childhood experiences are all from Lippmann's ROGD framework. Targownik presents these as established clinical facts without citing Lippmann, without disclosing Lippmann's methodological failures. Parent surveys from anti-trans websites, not youth data, not clinician assessments, and without acknowledging that Lippmann is an anti-transgender activist tied to organizations designed to restrict gender-affirming care. ROGD is not a legitimate scientific framework. ROGD is a discredited hypothesis that was failed to be reproduced in any rigorous scientific studies. The World Professional Association for Transgender Health, or WPATH, explicitly states, the term rapid onset gender dysphoria is not a medical identity recognized by any major professional association, nor is it listed as a subtype or classification in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM, or the International Classifications of Diseases, the ICD. The American Psychological Association, American Psychiatric Association, and WPATH, along with 60 other medical professional organizations, have explicitly called for the elimination of ROGD from clinical settings due to lack of reputable scientific evidence. Lippmann herself is embedded in anti-transgender activism. She's a principal officer of the Institute for Comprehensive Gender Dysphoria Research, ICGDR, founded in 2021 with Stella O'Malley of GenSpect, an organization Yale researchers described as spreading biased and unscientific content. Lippmann has contributed to anti-transgender publications and collaborated with individuals and organizations explicitly opposed to gender-affirming care for youth. But let us be charitable. Perhaps Targownik meant to cite an actual Canadian clinic data rather than Lippmann's parent surveys. I checked. Bauer et al. 2021, a study of transgender youth referred to Canadian clinics for gender-affirming care, found that 78.7% of youth in their sample were assigned female at birth. This is close to Targownik's 80% figure. Perhaps this is what she meant to reference. If so, she is still wrong. What Canadian clinics found. Bauer et al. Explicitly reject the ROGD explanation for the AFAB predominance. The researchers note another reason for the shift in AFAB-AMAB ratio is that for the assigned females, pressure to rapidly conform to feminine gender norms may contribute to the urgent need for clinical services at puberty. The researchers attribute the higher AFAB presentation to social pressure and gender conformity norms, not to the pathology Littman describes or that Targownik lists. The study further found that transgender youth in Canadian clinics were generally healthy, my apologies, with presentations of depression, anxiety, and support needs, and not the constellation of comorbidities, neurodiversity, personality disorder traits, and trauma that Targownik claims. When the researchers examined actual clinical characteristics, they found health profiles consistent with youth experiencing social stress and rejection, not the pathological syndrome Littman hypothesized or Targownik characterized. So whether Targownik is citing Littman's discredited parent surveys without attribution, or whether she is citing Canadian clinic data while ignoring what Canadian researchers concluded, the foundation of her argument collapses. She presents unattributed or misrepresented claims about comorbidity, neurodiversity, personality disorder traits, and trauma, claims derived from a discredited hypothesis created by an anti-transgender activist, as if they are documented features of AFAB youth seeking gender-affirming care. Canadian researchers studying the actual population found no such constellation. Littman's parent surveys, not youth data, not clinician assessments, form the basis of these claims. What Targownik has done is take a demographic proportion, 80% AFAB, and attach it to a set of psychological and developmental characteristics that are either 1, unattributed to Littman's discredited ROGD hypothesis, or 2, directly contradicted by the actual Canadian researchers who study this population. Either way, she is laundering scientifically unsupported claims through legitimate data without proper attribution or engagement with what the legitimate data actually shows. A defense worth addressing. One might argue that Targownik's omissions reflect the practical constraints of writing for a general audience. Scientific communication for lay readers requires simplification, the argument goes, and not every citation can be exhaustively documented in a public-facing article. This defense collapses immediately when you examine Targownik's actual brand and practice. Her entire professional identity rests on precision. The data-driven transsexual is not a casual marketing phrase, it is her credibility marker. When precision is your brand, you do not get to claim its absence as audience-friendly simplification. The omissions are not random products of space constraints, they are systematic. They consistently excise the exact context that would undermine her argument. McKinnon's explicit warnings and tracing the sources of his claims, the Oregon researchers' actual conclusions about access, the Bauer team's categorical rejection of ROGD. Random simplification produces varied omissions across different sections. Patterned simplification produces the same strategic omission every time. This is the second kind. It is certainly possible that Targownik possesses yet undisclosed sources that support her claims about comorbidity and developmental characteristics among AFAB youth seeking care. If such evidence exists, the question becomes inescapable. Why does she not cite it? Why does she not share it? The silence suggests the evidence does not exist in the form she implies. Fascinating. Fascinating, even. Oh, I love Red Bull. Okay. How is the Oregon study used? Having made these unsubstantiated claims about the clinical characteristics of AFAB youth seeking care, claims derived from a discredited theory and directly contradicted by actual Canadian clinic data, Targownik then pivots. She writes, a recently published study from Oregon, a U.S. state that has made similarly progressive policy choices around GAMC, is therefore highly instructive. But here's the critical problem. The Oregon study does not address any of the clinical characteristics Targownik has just claimed. It does not measure comorbidity, it does not measure neurodiversity, it does not measure personality disorder traits, it does not measure adverse childhood experiences, it does not measure the length of gender incongruence history. The Oregon study is a claims-based, read as insurance claims, utilization study. It measures how many youth in Oregon's insured population received gender-affirming medical care between 2016 and 2023. That is all it measures. Targownik is right that the Oregon study is instructive. It instructs us to draw conclusions from substantiated facts and not from leaps. Let us see what it actually shows. The Oregon researchers actually write, while Oregon's supportive policy environment, including the 2007 Equality Act, Medicaid coverage for medically necessary transgender care since 2014, and the 2023 SHIELD law, which prohibits insurance exclusions and requires adequate provider networks, likely contributed to the greater access relative to national averages. Read the distinction carefully. The researchers conclude that the policy environment contributed to greater access relative to national averages. They are documenting that when you remove financial and structural barriers to care, more people who need care can access it. Targownik reframes this evidence that culture of trans acceptance and permissive policy environment may be associated with higher uptake, implying that the policy is driving unnecessary care seeking, not enabling necessary access. These are fundamentally different claims. One is about access, one is about excess. The researchers further emphasize insurance likely serves as a marker for intersecting structural factors rather than an independent driver of access, and that families with commercial insurance may have advantages in navigating complex care systems, reflecting differences in socioeconomic resources, caregiver advocacy capacity, geographic access, and provider availability. The study is explicit. Variation in care seeking is driven by structural access barriers and socioeconomic factors, not by a permissive cult environment causing unnecessary medicalization. Targownik extracts the policy finding and reinterprets it as evidence of cultural overprescribing. She attributes causation to culture of trans acceptance when the researchers themselves attribute the variation to insurance access, socioeconomic resources, provider availability, and geographic access. She's speculating beyond what the evidence supports and contradicting what the researchers explicitly concluded. Now consider the specific statistics. Targownik accurately cites Oregon's raw statistic. Medical gender-affirming care for AFAB youth increased ninefold from 0.028% in 2016 to 0.25% in 2023. She highlights this increase to support her implication that Oregon's permissive policy environment is driving excessive prescribing. But here's what she does not emphasize. The ninefold increase, while real, obscures what the study actually documents. A ninefold increase from 0.028% to 0.25% means that in 2023, approximately 1 in 400 natal female adolescents in Oregon's insured population received testosterone. The study tracked 868,740 insured Oregon adolescents. Even with this ninefold increase, the absolute number of youth receiving care remains small. The researchers' explicit conclusion is that medical gender-affirming care for transgender and gender-diverse adolescents is rare in Oregon. Moreover, Targownik compares testosterone for use in AFAB youth to estrogen use in AMAB youth, noting that testosterone use is 4 times higher than the rate seen in natal boys. But this comparison obscures several critical confounds. First, she uses transmissic language, natal boys instead of naming trans girls, or AMAB youth receiving estrogen. Second, AFAB youth present for care at significantly later ages, compared around 15.9 years or 16 years, compared to AMAB youth, which is around 11.3 years, providing a longer window for testosterone accumulation. Additionally, AFAB youth initiate gender-affirming care at significantly higher rates than AMAB youth. As Julia Serrano notes, this disparity may reflect less stigma attached to behavioral masculinity in birth-assigned girls compared to behavioral femininity in birth-assigned boys, making it easier for AFAB youth to come out as transgender and seek medical care. Research suggests this care-seeking disparity reflects broader social factors, particularly greater societal stigma towards trans women, which may deter AMAB youth from seeking care. A 4 times difference in hormone use rates does not indicate excessive prescribing when the demographic composition and access patterns are dramatically different. Without controlling for age at presentation and care initiation rates, presenting this difference as evidence of or raising concern about over-medicalization is misleading, particularly when doing some reading based on what we know from other studies informs us that this is, as best we can determine, proportional and not pathological. Oh my goodness. Okay, I'm going to read this section, this D section, and then I'm going to take a quick break. I'm going to run to the restroom. What makes this worse is Targownik's claim about her own methodology. On June 22nd, 2026, she tweeted, "Everything I've put in there is cited and evidence-based. When there are limitations around the data, I'm forward with them. When I come to my conclusions, I come by them honestly and with consideration and nuance. I'm firmly opposed to SCGM's mission and resent the accusation that I am in cahoots. Continue to make it, and you are approaching defamation territory, so just be warned." Dear reader, no, I did not accuse her of being in cahoots with SCGM. This is demonstrably false. Targownik does not adequately foreground or discuss the study's own stated limitations. The Gray et al. Study itself notes that the data only captures insured adolescents, meaning missing uninsured and underinsured populations, that claims data does not capture all care, and that documenting trends does not determine causation. Targownik mentions none of these. She leads with the 9-fold increase without acknowledging that the study's own conclusion is that care remains rare. That is context that would appropriately scale the finding. Furthermore, she provides no additional data or context from the field of relevant studies. Instead, she uses this data point in the study out of context and in a vacuum. Her conclusions lack the nuance she claims. She speculates beyond what the evidence supports. She reframes the researcher's finding about access as a cautionary tale about uptake. She does not acknowledge why the comparative prescribing rates actually support proportional care rather than access. She misquotes the study's conclusions about what drives variation. This is very fascinating so far. All right, let's keep going. All right. Psychotherapy first. Evidence for what exactly? Targownik recommends psychotherapy as a first-line treatment before or in place of gender-affirming medical care. She does this while acknowledging in her own article that there is scant evidence for psychological interventions being effective in facilitating spontaneous desistance or in improving outcomes of a subsequent medical transition. As this is interesting, as it is remarkable, particularly for someone who bills themselves as the data-driven transsexual. She acknowledges the absence of evidence for psychotherapy first approaches, then recommends them anyway. She documents the lack of evidence base, then prescribes from hope, the belief that a child may encounter spontaneous dysphoria-free remission. Because it is less preferred than a spontaneous dysphoria-free remission, even if it is likely preferred over a dysphoria persistent repression. I have a high quality of life outcome of my transition, 0 regrets, but it was very costly both financially and socially. If there was a path that would have instead led to a dysphoria-free remittance, it would have been preferable. In response to the question, why are you operating from the position of transition being an undesirable outcome? This is not data or evidence driven. This is Targownik projecting her life and values on other people, and that is not medicine or science, that is ideology. The broader research literature supports this skepticism. The American Psychological Association notes that attempts to change sexual orientation or gender identity are some of the most damaging practices in the history of mental health. Studies consistently show that talk therapy does not change gender identity. When psychotherapy is beneficial, it is when it supports a person's authentic identity. When psychotherapy is beneficial, it is when it supports, I just read that, including gender transition, not when it attempts to prevent or discourage it. The evidence is clear. Psychotherapy used to suppress gender identity harms people. Psychotherapy used to support gender identity helps people. But what does change with psychotherapy? Distress decreases when a person is supported in their gender identity. Distress increases when they are encouraged to suppress it. This is not ambiguous. This is documented. Targownik is recommending an intervention that the evidence base does not support, acknowledges the lack of evidentiary support, and which research suggests may be harmful when used to delay or discourage transition. This is not evidence-based or data-driven medicine. This is ideological-based medicine in a white coat. In a more charitable read, Targownik could be expressing the idea that psychotherapy first is not an attempt to change one's gender identity, which would appear to align with her inferred values, but as a means to wait and see, while exploring where the dysphoria comes from, and an attempt to measure how insistent, consistent, and persistent it is. This is a more defensible framing, but it still fails for 3 reasons. The wait-and-see defense. First, Targownik herself has already foreclosed this defense. She acknowledged that there is scant evidence for psychological interventions being effective in facilitating spontaneous desistance. If the goal is to wait and see whether dysphoria resolves, and the evidence shows psychotherapy does not facilitate that resolution, then what exactly is the youth waiting for? The exploration has no defined endpoint, no measurable threshold for completion, and no evidence base indicating it achieves its stated purpose. It is an indefinite delay dressed as assessment. Second, wait and see is not a neutral act. The evidence is clear that delays in gender-affirming care are not benign. Tordoff et al. Found that youth who did not initiate hormone treatment within the first 3 to 6 months of care experienced a 2 to 3-fold increase in depression and suicidality. Turbin et al. Found that transgender adults who accessed hormone treatment during adolescence had significantly better mental health outcomes than those who waited until adulthood. Waiting has a documented cost. It is not the absence of intervention, it is an active decision to withhold an intervention with documented benefits while a youth's mental health deteriorates. The charitable framing assumes the delay is harmless. The evidence says it is not. Third, insistent, consistent, and persistent is itself a general rule of thumb for parents to observe in their children starting at an early age. It is not supposed to be used as a gatekeeping framework and is not a clinical framework. To use it as such requires youth to perform their suffering over an extended period to demonstrate that their dysphoria is sufficiently severe, sufficiently enduring, and sufficiently unwavering to satisfy an evaluator's standard of legitimacy. But the Bauer et al. Study of Canadian clinical populations found youth were generally healthy, with depression, anxiety, and support needs, not a population requiring extended diagnostic surveillance to rule out pathology. The framework assumes that dysphoria is suspect until proven otherwise, that the burden of proof falls on the youth, and that the default position is restriction rather than care. It inverts the standard. Instead of providing treatment and monitoring outcomes, it withholds treatment while demanding proof that the treatment is warranted just to be sure. Proof that, by Targownik's own admission, psychotherapy cannot produce. The wait-and-see defense replaces one problem with another. It concedes that psychotherapy is not conversion therapy, but it preserves the same functional outcome: delayed access, prolonged distress, and a gauntlet of proof before care. Calling it exploration rather than gatekeeping does not change what it does. A door that is locked while someone decides whether you deserve to walk through it is still a locked door, regardless of how thoughtfully the lock is considered. The strongest defense of psychotherapy first approaches is that they function not as a replacement for medical care, but as a genuine concurrent support, that exploration and assessment represent good clinical practice. Sorry, I lost my place. Not gatekeeping. This distinction matters. It matters enormously. If psychotherapy accompanies transition and supports a young person's authentic identity, it serves them. If psychotherapy precedes and delays transition pending uncertain outcomes and unspecified thresholds of proof, it restricts access. These are different architectures producing different outcomes. Targownik's framing is unambiguous about which architecture she is advocating. She recommends psychotherapy as first-line therapy, requires long-standing objective evidence of dysphoria before medical intervention, and suggests deferral for whatever it is possible to tolerate. For wherever it is possible to tolerate. These are sequential gates, not concurrent supports. The youth must pass through psychotherapy first, demonstrate sufficient evidence of persistent dysphoria, and prove they can endure waiting. Then perhaps medical care follows. This is not psychotherapy alongside transition. This is psychotherapy instead of transition, unless and until you meet undefined criteria of severity and persistence and proof. The architecture is sequential restriction, not concurrent support. Targownik further recommends that decisions around the initiation of testosterone be deferred, and suggests that continuous oral contraceptives or progestin-based methods can address dysphoria-related menstruation, allowing testosterone to be delayed or avoided entirely. This claim requires an examination of what the evidence actually says, and more importantly, what it reveals about the logic underneath. Man, what a day. I've been streaming for almost 4 hours now, and we're barely halfway through this one. Crazy. The contraception study Targownik cites concludes TGD-AYA, transgender adolescent/young adult patients, may seek contraception care that is discreet, avoids estrogen, helps alleviate gender dysphoria, and potentially leads to amenorrhea. Amenorrhea. I don't know what amenorrhea is. And further, there continues to be a need to assess contraception use and preferences in TGD adolescent and young adults. What this study actually documents is that transgender youth seek contraceptive methods that suppress menstruation. This is not the same as claiming that menstrual suppression alone addresses gender dysphoria or makes testosterone unnecessary. The distinction matters clinically and ethically. Targownik conflates two separate problems: dysphoria from menstruation specifically, and systemic gender dysphoria from sex characteristics across the body. Contraceptive-induced amenorrhea addresses the first, testosterone addresses the second, plus the constellation of other concerns: voice, facial hair, body fat distribution, muscle development, etc., while menstrual suppression alone produces none of these outcomes for systemic dysphoria. The research on what addresses the second is unambiguous: decreased depression, anxiety, suicidality, self-harm, gender dysphoria, and body dissatisfaction, as well as increased quality of life and life satisfaction. Amenorrhea is the absence of menstruation. Well, thank you, buddy. Thanks for being my Google bot. Appreciate you. These outcomes are associated with gender-affirming hormone therapy, testosterone in transmasculine individuals, not with menstrual suppression through contraception alone. At best, for some youth, contraception may help manage their dysphoria regarding menstruation specifically, which the research shows is indeed valued. But using that as justification for deferring testosterone does not follow logically. You are treating one specific part of dysphoria while withholding treatment for systemic dysphoria. The logic is not medical, it is gatekeeping. Offering contraception-induced amenorrhea as a substitute for testosterone is, at best, partial relief, like giving 50 milliliters of water to a person dying of thirst in a desert, just enough to keep them alive a little longer, dangling the full canteen just out of reach. At worst, it is withholding care as an interrogation means dressed up as compassionate concern. Targownik is performing a sleight of hand. She takes a study about preferences for menstrual management, what youth want from contraception, and extracts from it permission to defer access to testosterone. But the study documents no evidence that make amenorrhea-induced contraception addresses systemic gender dysphoria or makes testosterone unnecessary. It documents only that youth want menstrual suppression and that research gaps remain about how to provide it safely and effectively. When pressed about her gatekeeping stance on social media, Targownik revealed her underlying framework in a June 2026 Twitter exchange. She explained her position on rapid apparency gender dysphoria, ROGD language, but softened. Changing the mind or providing access to non-medical interventional pathways to promote desistance should be preferred if and only if there is a reasonable chance that it will be successful. Perhaps for the rapid apparency dysphoria that seems prevalent among adolescent girls, this is a reasonable approach, so long as there is a futility trigger in place. For natal boys, I have seen much less evidence, and I am much less sanguine that the mind can be talked out of the underlying motivation to transition. This statement begs the question it pretends to answer. She assumes AFAB rapid onset dysphoria is less real or more reversible, talked out of, than AMAB dysphoria, then uses that assumption to justify psychotherapy first. But she provides no evidence that AFAB dysphoria is reversible. She provides no evidence that psychotherapy can successfully discourage or resolve it. She assumes the premise, rapid onset means less real, and calls the conclusion evidence-based. Therefore, psychotherapy first is reasonable. This is putting aside the fact that there is not credible evidence that rapid onset dysphoria is even a real phenomena, or just a misperception attributed to a much more plausible and likely circumstance. We discovered a lot more stars and planets once we discovered telescopes, and that when we stopped punishing people for being left-handed, we suddenly had a surge in left-handed people in the world. Occam's razor applies. The statement also reveals her underlying hierarchy. AMAB dysphoria, early onset, persistent, is real and immutable. AFAB dysphoria, recent onset, rapid, is suspect and reversible. Psychotherapy first makes sense for the suspect dysphoria. Restriction makes sense for the suspect population. Targownik identifies publicly as a transmedicalist. Like yourself, I am open and honest about being a transmedicalist. I strongly believe that most people benefit from the involvement of people with clinical expertise and experience, no matter which health condition they afflicted with, and trying to navigate. While I am still negotiating with myself, where I am still negotiating with myself is on whether the role of the physician is to act in the patient's best interest or in society's best interest, or more accurately, how does one balance their responsibility as a physician when the patient's interests and society's interests may be in conflict? This tweet is in response to Brianna Wu, RE Bringing Back Mandated Therapy Waiting Periods and Medical Gatekeeping, December 11th, 2024. Transmedicalism is a hierarchical framework that ranks whose gender dysphoria counts as legitimate, really trans, based on specific criteria: onset trajectory, duration, severity, and consistency of presentation. See transmedicalism.info. In case of a 404 error, simply refresh the browser. It is a fringe stance within the trans community. Outside it, this is simply a pathologization of a minority's care and the resultant paternalistic gatekeeping of said minority. Under transmedicalism, some dysphoria is real and deserves medical response. Other dysphoria is suspect, reversible, or insufficiently severe. The degree and stance varies by transmedicalists. They are not a monolith. This framework explains Targownik's differential treatment of AFAB and AMAB dysphoria and rapid onset versus early onset. It explains why she assumes AMAB early onset dysphoria is immutable, while AFAB rapid onset dysphoria is reversible. It explains the gatekeeping logic. Certain youth must prove their dysphoria meets the threshold of legitimacy before access to care. This is not evidence-based medicine. It is an ideological stance where in the ranking dysphoria by its trajectory and assigning care accordingly determines who is really trans or one of the good ones that will have positive results and outcome. Gatekeeping is not incidental to transmedicalism, it is the framework's entire function. To rank dysphoria by legitimacy, you must have gatekeepers deciding which dysphoria counts. The ideology requires someone to determine who is really trans or one of the good ones. The effect is gatekeeping wrapped in psychological and medical pathologization. I'll get it. And it is exactly the kind of hierarchy that leads to differential treatment based on nothing more substantial than timing, body, and clinician vibes. We love vibes, don't we, folks? The architecture of restriction. Targownik's article exhibits several characteristic logical and or rhetorical moves that deserve further examination. Appeal to authority. White coat legitimacy. Sans Undertale mentioned. Whoa, oh my god, Sans Undertale, I can't believe it. He showed up. He finally showed up. I'm just kidding. Oh, Lord. Oh, Lord. Okay. They said the thing. They said the thing. He said the line. He said the line. I'm going to take another sip of Red Bull real quick. We love it. We love Red Bull. Okay. Targownik invokes her credentials as a physician and epidemiologist to speak on authority on gender medicine. Oh, fuck. Okay. Despite having no clinical work with trans youth, no published research in gender medicine, and no formal training in gender-affirming care, her credentials speak only to training in gastroenterology and disease utilization patterns, epidemiology, yet a reader encountering the article sees MD, an epidemiologist, and grants authority on gender medicine that her actual credentials do not support. Epidemiology is the study of disease patterns and etiology, though it should go without saying, but gender identity is not a disease. The credentials to become a stand-in for expertise they do not represent. It provides rhetorical cover that obscures the gap between her formal training and the unrelated domain she is addressing. Argument from ignorance layered with asymmetrical burden of proof, essentially dismissing valid data while requiring perfect data. Targownik documents the absence of evidence that psychotherapy works for this population, then uses that absence as justification to recommend it first line. She treats lack of evidence as evidence of safety, likely minimal adverse effects. Simultaneously, she treats uncertainty about long-term testosterone outcomes as justification for restricting access to an intervention that does have evidence of benefit. The evidentiary standard is asymmetrical. Lack of evidence for X becomes a reason to use X, while good evidence for Y becomes a reason to defer to Y. She also dismisses existing long-term data as low quality or low certainty, while simultaneously using the absence of different long-term data as justification for gatekeeping. Low quality does not mean invalid, suspect, or speculative. It is valid evidence that should be weighed, not dismissed. She demands perfect, high certainty before permitting access while accepting uncertainty as sufficient reason to restrict it. This is not evidence-based medicine. It is ideology disguised as caution wrapped in the language of care. Soft restriction as measured caution, a rhetorical strategy / fallacy. Could otherwise be considered a form of doublespeak or linguistic obfuscation. Targownik frames her position as support for access in the right circumstances, while simultaneously recommending psychotherapy first, defined criteria for access, and deferral wherever manageable to delay. But psychotherapy first is not support for access. It is prioritizing a different intervention before access to the requested one. Where it can be tolerated is not clinical guidance, it is discretionary threshold setting based on pain tolerance and clinician judgment. She is architecting restriction while using language of care and measured caution. The soft language obscures the hard gatekeeping. A reader sees, I still believe access can help, and misses, I am recommending you wait, prove yourself, jump through these narrowing gates. Have a good one, Haku. Be safe, don't die. Targownik cites 2 systemic reviews to support her claim that considerable uncertainty exists. However, both reviews were funded by the Society for Evidence-Based Gender Medicine, SEGM, an organization explicitly dedicated to restricting gender-affirming care, and has been classified as a hate group by the Southern Poverty Law Center. All authors of both papers have a long-standing affiliation with SEGM. More importantly, Targownik presents these two reviews as representative of the available literature without acknowledging that far more comprehensive, long-term, and consistent evidence to the contrary exists. Evidence showing that gender-affirming care improves mental health outcomes and reduces suicidality in transgender youth. She omits any citation to systemic reviews or meta-analyses demonstrating these benefits. She selects conflicted reviews that align with her gatekeeping position while omitting non-conflicted evidence that contradicts it. This is not literature synthesis, and it is not her being data-driven, transparent, and reasoned, or in her own words, everything I've put in there is cited and evidence-based. When there are limitations around the data, I am forward with them. When I come to my conclusions, I come by them honestly and with consideration and nuance. I am firmly opposed to SEGM's mission and resent the accusation that I am in cahoots. Continue to make it, and you are approaching defamation territory, so just be warned. Furthermore, with various claims throughout her article, Targownik focuses extensively on detransition rates and potential long-term harms of testosterone, while downplaying the documented harms of delay, denial, and gatekeeping itself. She presents detransition rates without context, external pressures, discrimination, lack of family support, and restriction-induced detransition, in McKinnon's own finding. The evidence she selects builds a narrow narrative. Testosterone can be harmful, while omitting the equally valid narrative, restriction can be harmful, while simultaneously omitting the known benefits. Selective evidence is not evidence-based analysis, and selective data points is not being data-driven. It is narrative building in service of a predetermined conclusion. Begging the question, assuming the premise she is trying to prove. Targownik, which raises an obvious question, given this uncertainty about the risks and benefits of long-term testosterone exposure in dysphoric natal females. How comfortable are we in Canada continuing a set of policies and clinical norms that may be contributing to the significant rise in use? She presents rising rates of testosterone use as evidence of a problem requiring policy change, but she never establishes that rising rates indicate inappropriate care. She assumes the premise, rising rates are concerning, and frames the conclusion as inevitable. Therefore, we should change policy. A more parsimonious explanation. Rising rates reflect improved access to diagnosis and care for a population previously underdiagnosed and undertreated. Appropriate care naturally produces higher rates when previously denied populations gain access. She does not prove rising rates indicate over-medicalizing. She assumes it. Undefined terms / vagueness, technical language as gatekeeping mechanism. Targownik, most importantly, testosterone-based GAMC should be considered only when there is an established long-standing objective evidence of dysphoria, sustained integration in the gender role associated with the target sex, or if there is an evidence of clinically meaningful worsening of mental health, which can be ascribed to ongoing dysphoria despite psychological interventions. She provides no definitions for long-standing, 1 year, 3 years, 5 years, before puberty onset, objective evidence, self-report, behavioral observation, what threshold, or established by whom, what standard. She has written gatekeeping criteria in language that sounds clinically rigorous, while remaining utterly subjective. A clinician can cite insufficient objective evidence to deny care. A different clinician can accept the same presentation as established long-standing objective evidence. The criteria are not objective. They are subjective and a discretionary power dressed in technical language. That is not evidence-based medicine. That is the architecture of restriction. Finally, what is notable is that all of these fallacies and rhetorical moves are wrapped in measured, cited, and careful language. They are not crude or obvious. They are respectable, and the form obscures the content. A reader encountering this article sees what appears to be evidence-based analysis from a credentialed, knowledgeable person who happens to have the additional credibility of the lived experience of a trans woman, and not the logical or rhetorical fallacies. That is the power of the presentation and why it is dangerous without critical thought and or prior knowledge of the field. How much longer do we have here, bro? This is such a long article. Oh my god. Oh my god. Okay. Oh, how are we feeling, chat? How are we feeling? Are we enjoying the stream today? Are we enjoying politics? It's been 4 hours. Are you getting tired of me doing politics today? I'm almost tired of it. Almost. All right. Let's go. The past is prologue. A pattern emerges. The June article deploys 3 major and specific mechanisms, each identifiable, each repeated. They are not accidents of style or tone, they are architectural. First, assumption without verification. Claims about AFAB youth are presented without citation. Shorter histories of apparent gender incongruent behaviors, higher rates of psychological comorbidity and neurodiversity, more personality disorder traits, and more frequent histories of adverse childhood experiences. When sources can be traced, they lead to discredited frameworks or are misrepresented. The assumption precedes the evidence. Second, representing unreliable information as fact. Lippmann's ROGD framework is laundered through unattributed references. McKinnon is cited without disclosing his explicit warnings against Targownik's conclusions or the basis of his numbers and their problematic origin. The Oregon study is cited while misrepresenting the researcher's conclusions. Hedged language, such as may have, could, might, is deployed as evidence-based caution, while speculative risks justify gatekeeping. The form obscures the function. Third, selective citation and admitted context. McKinnon's detransition figures are quoted while his warnings about misuse are omitted. Studies concluding care is generally safe are cited while using conditional language that implies harm. The Oregon researcher's attribution of variation to structural barriers is ignored in favor of cultural over-medicalization or being over-permissive. She demonstrated in April that she understood these mechanisms perfectly fine. In June, she deployed them anyway. In June, she omits them strategically. These 3 mechanisms are not unique to June. They often appear together, sometimes even in the same sequence, in her Twitter exchanges on ROGD and gatekeeping, and throughout many of her social media, blog, and podcast content. A Twitter thread reveals, just as one example to highlight, in January of this year, 2026, Targownik deployed these 3 mechanisms in a Twitter exchange on ROGD/social contagion and gatekeeping. The exchange is instructive because it captures the pattern under pressure and what happens when she is challenged in real time to substantiate her claims. Assumption without verification. Targownik opened with a declarative claim, paraphrased for simplicity. We need to accept that this is a thing that happened. Social media and other cultural elements likely induce gender dysphoria in some adolescents who might have otherwise not experienced it. No citation, no data, no caveat. The claim is presented as something that must be accepted. I don't know how to pronounce this. I'm not going to try. Fait accompli? Whatever. Requiring agreement, not evidence. Representing unreliable information as fact under pressure. When challenged to provide empirical support, she did not cite studies. Instead, she shifted the framing. First, it is the hedging of this is emerging data, and when pressed to show that data, it becomes I'm not claiming it as a proven theory. She reframed from we need to accept this happened to it's the most compelling active hypothesis. I make no claim that it's proven, just the most compelling active hypothesis given the empiric nature of the available data. I'm not claiming it's a proven theory. We have an empiric phenomenon, rapid rise in incidence of trans identification in medical seeking, that requires us to be thoughtful as to what are the possible etiologic factors that best explain it. There are a number of competing hypotheses that seek to explain this phenomenon, which are not necessarily mutually exclusive. We should not out of hand discard any hypothesis which may be compelling just because its implications are politically inconvenient. As it stands, as an epidemiologist, if I saw a similar phenomena with any other condition, the most likely explanation would be an emergent exposure, and I would be looking at what emergent exposures would be particularly prevalent among the subdemographics that are most affected. I would also like to look to see if there are any changes in screening/surveillance that were targeted at specific subpopulations that would give the appearance of a rise in incidence, i.e., case ascertainment effects. Because this area is so politically charged, it is understandable how that may motivate people to latch on to hypotheses that are politically aligned or discard those that are politically inconvenient. This is not an issue I worry as much about when I am studying the changing epidemiology of IBD, as an example. But the reframing only occurred after being pressed. The initial move, present speculation as established fact, remain unchanged. She then used epidemiological authority to legitimize the hypothesis. To paraphrase the thread so far, as an epidemiologist, I see social contagion as the most compelling active hypothesis, framing her professional credentials as evidence for the claim itself. But social contagion is not an active hypothesis. It is a thoroughly discredited and debunked hypothesis. Furthermore, this particular tweet commits a category error wrapped in her appeal to authority, her credentials. Targownik frames the rise in trans identification through epidemiological language, emergent exposure, case ascertainment, invoking professional authority to suggest that social and cultural factors are causing trans identity like a virus causes infection, or that it is spreading in a similar fashion. But the correlate to her example in this thread is social contagion. But epidemiology studies pathological conditions, not one's identity. Applying outbreak logic to one's identity requires the unstated premise that trans identity is itself pathological. Moreover, she acknowledges case ascertainment effects, improved visibility due to reduced gatekeeping, as a possibility, then dismisses it in favor of emergent exposure without evidence. This isn't epidemiology, it's transmedicalism dressed in scientific language. Selective citation and omitted context, substantive evasion. When people cited studies contradicting her position, she did not engage with what those studies said. She dismissed them categorically. People have posted well-intentioned but flawed studies that do not disprove her hypothesis. She did not identify what made them flawed. She did not address their actual findings. She deflected the substantive challenge by questioning the methodology of the challengers rather than engaging with the evidence. The mechanism revealed. What the Twitter exchange demonstrates is that three mechanisms in sequence and under pressure. 1, make an assumption or belief, claim, and present it as fact. 2, when challenged, hedge the claim while using authority to legitimize it. And 3, when asked for evidence or evidence contradicts you, dismiss the evidence without substantive engagement. This is not how evidence-based analysis works. It is how narrative management works. The pattern in history, March 2020. But this is not new. So this is getting into like the personal censure of her, right? 6 years before June 2026, under professional scrutiny, Targownik deployed the exact same three mechanisms. In March 2020, the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Manitoba issued a formal censure of Dr. Laura Targownik. The pattern they documented was precise. She had represented unreliable information as fact, made assumptions without verifying them, when concerns were raised, did not engage substantively with those concerns, and finally had inappropriately referenced information that had come to her attention as a physician leader. The censure stated explicitly, it is aggravating that Dr. Targownik did so based on unreliable information that she presented as fact. Specifically, the committee found that Dr. Targownik had made assumptions about a patient's personal situation without verifying them, financial circumstances, immigration status, knowledge state, failed to verify basic facts before making public statements, inappropriately referenced information obtained through her position as a physician leader, been not aware of the facts while presenting her concerns as an established fact in a national forum to 7,800 physicians, not discussed concerns directly with the subject of her critique before publicizing them. The committee's conclusion was direct. She should have made an effort to discuss the matter with him first, or, in the alternative, limited the communications about her concerns to bring them forward to the appropriate authority. Instead, she published unverified claims in a national forum with widespread professional visibility, damaging a colleague's reputation based on assumptions she had not verified yet presented as fact. The architecture is habitual. The three mechanisms are not confined to one article or one Twitter thread. They form a pattern documented under professional scrutiny in 2020, deployed in real time on social media and throughout much of her content, and reflected with sophistication and intent in her June 2026 article. What makes this pattern significant is not that it happened once. It is that she knows that what these mechanisms are, how they function, and how they undermine substantive analysis. Her April article demonstrates this knowledge explicitly. Her past disciplinary record shows she has been held accountable for this in the past. Next, we will examine how, within weeks, she deployed them anyway. In April 2026, Targownik documented with meticulous precision how SEGM weaponizes research in an article titled, "What the Finnish Register Study Can and Cannot Tell Us About Mental Health and Gender Dysphoric Youth," on her Substack blog. She identified their methods with granular specificity, how uncertainty about outcomes gets converted into justification for restriction, how methodological limitations get treated as evidence of harm, how silence on a topic gets converted into consensus against an intervention. Her April analysis demonstrated that she understands these mechanisms completely. She can identify them. She can articulate why they are intellectually dishonest. Yet, what is instructive about her April analysis itself is that even while surgically precise about SEGM's methods, it remains curiously charitable about their motivations. She acknowledges their work had to anticipate that results would be overgeneralized, even suggesting the risk of misuse was quietly welcomed. But then she softens, attributing the methodological choices to budget constraints and data reuse rather than to deliberate design. She does not interrogate why they selected crude outcome measures when richer ones existed in the dataset, or why the decision architecture consistently skewed toward one conclusion. This matters because Targownik operates from within the same epistemological framework as those she critiques. She can identify SEGM's data misuse while remaining generous about their intent because she shares their underlying assumption that caution about medical transition is defensible even when the evidence does not require it. She critiques their tactics while accepting their premises. Her April analysis, rigorous as it is, remains bounded by a gatekeeping logic she does not integrate. She does not ask why transition faces higher evidentiary demands than other medical interventions, or why insufficient evidence consistently translates to restrict access rather than conduct better research with protected access. When someone can identify a mechanism so precisely, explain its dishonesty so clearly, and then deploy it themselves, the question shifts. It is no longer whether they understand the machinery. They clearly do. The question becomes whether the machinery itself has become inseparable from their thinking, whether understanding it and operating it have become the same act. On April 24th, she was explicit. SEGM is not a hate group, but they are a biased group with a specific agenda which is totally allowed. They promote low-quality research with minimal criticism when it aligns with their priors, and they pick apart equally low-quality research when it doesn't align with their priors. This is an accurate description of confirmation bias in research evaluation. It is also precisely what she does in her June article. She promotes low-quality research without skepticism or without criticism when it aligns with her prior that affirming care needs gatekeeping. She picks apart higher quality research when it contradicts her prior by dismissing the researcher's explanations as ideologically motivated. Not in broad strokes, not in general principle, but mechanism by mechanism, almost point for point. This is a table. What SEGM does compared to what Targownik does. I'm not going to read the whole table. I think that's a waste of time. We get the idea. You're comparing the two, and you're saying the same. This is not coincidence. Coincidence requires independent arrival at the same position. This does not appear to be coincidence. Okay, you repeated yourself. This is application of a documented playbook by someone who has publicly explained exactly how the playbook functions and why it is dishonest. The cardiovascular example. The study Targownik cites on cardiovascular effects concludes, the available evidence on cardiovascular mortality associated with testosterone therapy, the absence of cardiovascular deaths in short-term randomized trials, does not allow inference regarding the long-term cardiovascular safety, highlighting the need for adequately powered studies with extended follow-up. What the study actually says, no cardiovascular deaths were observed in short-term trials. We cannot use that short-term data to conclude anything about long-term safety. We need better long-term research. Where Targownik claims, testosterone may also have clinically relevant adverse effects on markers of cardiovascular health. She's converted, we observe no deaths but need more research, into there are likely adverse effects. This is the precise move she documented SEGM making in April. She identified it as intellectually dishonest. Now she is deploying it. The liver study example. The study on liver safety concludes with absolute clarity. The current studies indicate that recommended GAHT formulations are generally safe, with few hepatic side effects. And most directly, based on the best evidence currently available, modern GAHT is generally safe from a hepatology perspective when used according to guidelines. What the study actually says is that GAHT is generally safe. We have identified knowledge gaps we should study further. Where Targownik claims is it may also have clinically relevant adverse effects on markers of liver health. She's performing the exact maneuver she documented in SEGM doing in April, treating we need better research as evidence of harm. The study says this is safe. She cites it to suggest it might not be. She uses conditional language to create plausible deniability while implying risk. Oh my god, this guy! I did not expect Benjamin Ryan to show up here today, but okay. Not a fan of Mr. Ryan, not a huge fan of Mr. Ryan. I don't know much about him, but he seems kind of flat. When Targownik hosted Benjamin Ryan on a February 2026 podcast, she concluded by describing him as an honest broker who takes an honest look at the data. What does an honest look at the data mean in practice? Taking an honest look at the data means engaging with how the researchers who collected it interpret their own findings. It means substantively addressing their explanations if you disagree. When Ryan examines the Oregon study, he accepts the raw numbers but dismisses the author's evidence-based explanations. That variation reflects guideline concordant assessment, variable timing of gender identity development, and barriers or delays in accessing care. His dismissal is cursory. I cannot see how they can know of any of this based on looking at the data. He then substitutes a speculative ideological explanation that Oregon's progressive culture explains the variation. This is not supported by the data. It is not evidence-based. It is an assumption that serves his predetermined conclusion. This is not an honest look at the data. It is accepting data while rejecting methodology and replacing it with ideology. Yet Targownik, who would document these same mechanisms as dishonest gatekeeping tactics just 2 months later in April, endorsed Ryan's work as honest and described him as taking an honest look at the data. She even adopted his framing of the Fox Varian case as her opening narrative, then performed critical engagement by pushing back on specific data points, puberty blocker continuation rates, while leaving his core premises untouched, that ROGD and social contagion is a clinical phenomenon, that affirming care is whatever you say goes, and that SEGM's concerns, while aggressively pursued, identified real problems. This is a pattern. Critical scrutiny of details, absorption of premises. She receives credit for engaging carefully while the foundational architecture passes through unchecked. The question becomes unavoidable. Does she genuinely believe Ryan is an honest broker, or does she recognize that his methodology mirrors SEGM's documented gatekeeping apparatus, and she is credentialing him anyway because his conclusions align with her own? Either answer is damaging. The first suggests she cannot recognize the mechanism she spent in April documenting. The second suggests she recognizes it and endorses it when it's convenient for her own narrative. Validators of a feather. The National Post article that concludes Targownik is not neutral journalism documenting multiple medical perspectives. It is an outlier with a documented conservative editorial stance. All Sides rates it as lean right, systematically publishing content skeptical of gender-affirming care. Doctors and parents need to rethink gender-affirming care for children. Groundswell against gender-affirming care becomes too loud to ignore, and take a cautious approach to gender-affirming treatments for minors. The National Post coverage pattern is systematic. It emphasizes polling data showing public skepticism, platforms experts expressing caution, and frames the issue through the lens of vulnerable youth needing protection. In this context, the National Post article strategically positions medical professionals as validators of skepticism toward gender-affirming care, and the doctors in interviews 3 clinicians expressing caution: Dr. Gordon Gyat, affiliated with SEGM and its restrictive positions; Dr. Karine Kachachuchurian, who says she would challenge medicalizing the majority while maintaining "I strongly believe in this care"; and Dr. Laura Targownik, who advances most SEGM talking points wholesale. The National Post frames these 3 independent experts reaching similar conclusions about the need for caution. What they actually represent is 3 different expressions of the same gatekeeping agenda, dressed in different rhetorical framings, offering 3 different validators to choose from: the experienced researcher and scientist, the "I used to believe in this" clinician turned skeptic, and the trans validator: "I am trans and even I think this is concerning." All 3 recommended the same functional outcome: fewer youth accessing care, delayed access, and more gatekeeping barriers. The critical insight is this: more rigorous assessment is gatekeeping. When you add psychotherapy requirements, extended assessment timelines, require long-standing objective evidence of dysphoria, and defer access pending this rigor, you have restricted access. You have narrowed the gates and simply called it something else. Kachachuchuian's more rigorous care and Targovnik's evidence-based caution and Gyat's established SEGM positions are functionally identical. They all result in fewer youth receiving timely care. This matters because Targownik presents herself as an independent voice, pragmatic, data-driven, guided by evidence rather than ideology, yet her documented alignment with SEGM-affiliated researchers, her selective engagement with figures like Ryan, her adoption of many of SEGM's talking points wholesale, and her self-identification as a trans medicalist reveals a more constrained and ideological position. It is not a neutral position or ideology. It is the framework that transforms gatekeeping from deviation into principle, which is precisely what makes it so difficult to challenge from within the community. So, where does that leave us? Targownik has given us the answer herself. In April 2026, she documented with meticulous precision how SEGM weaponizes uncertainty, how methodological weakness becomes ideological strength, how the language of caution obscures the machinery of gatekeeping. She identified the mechanisms. She articulated their dishonesty. She explained exactly how they work. Then she uses them, not in broad strokes, not in general principle, but mechanism by mechanism, almost point for point, the same conversion of absence of evidence into permission to restrict, the same selective citation stripped of context, the same hedging language that maintains plausible deniability while implying harm, the same laundering of discredited frameworks through careful attribution games. She has become precisely what she diagnosed. This would be simply ironic if the target were her intellectual consistency, but the target is not abstract. The target is real youth experiencing genuine distress. About 8,500 that we know of in Oregon, thousands in Canada, youth whose only crime is seeking help from a medical system increasingly gatekept not by evidence, but by the carefully constructed respectability politics of people who understand the machinery well enough to operate it. What makes Targovnik's position particularly effective and particularly dangerous is not accidental. She stands behind credentials and a white coat. She speaks from within the medical establishment and from a trans identity. She can articulate legitimate medical concern in language that, word for word, would be transmissive gatekeeping if spoken by a cisgender physician. But because she speaks from the position of both medical expertise and community membership simultaneously, those same mechanisms become legible as rigor rather than restriction. The machinery is harder to see when it is operated by someone the community has reason to believe should be on their side. The machinery works because it is dressed in the right language, deployed by the right credentials, embedded in the right professional networks, and delivered by someone in the community has trained itself to trust, one of their own. Targownik has become fluent in that language. At what point does operating the machinery you have publicly exposed become indistinguishable from the machinery itself? Damn, we're almost done with this. Okay. What honest scholarship actually requires. This analysis is not to establish that gender-affirming care requires no scrutiny. It does. Every medical intervention warrants rigorous evaluation, honest assessment of outcomes, and willingness to revise protocols as evidence accumulates. The question is not whether scrutiny is appropriate. The question is how that scrutiny is conducted. Honest scholarship on pediatric gender medicine would cite sources with their full context, including limitations the researchers themselves identified, distinguish between absence of evidence and evidence of absence, between we don't have long-term data and we have evidence of harm, represent the conclusions researchers actually reached rather than reframing them to serve a predetermined position, acknowledge when cited researchers explicitly warn against a specific use being made of their work, disclose methodological weakness in sources relied upon, including author affiliations, ethical findings, and documented ideological positioning, maintain consistency between the standards applied to evidence supporting one's position and the standards applied to evidence challenging it, recommend interventions only when the evidence base supports them, or clearly label recommendations as value-based rather than evidence-based, avoid hedging language that maintains plausible deniability while implying conclusions that evidence does not support. None of these are unreasonable standards. They are not partisan. They are not advocacy-driven. They are the baseline standards of intellectual integrity. These are the standards Targownik herself articulated in April 2026 when she diagnosed SCGM's dishonesty. They are the standards any clinician presenting themselves as data-driven should meet without question. They are the standards that protect youth, whether those youth need access to gender-affirming care or protection from premature or inappropriate intervention, because honest evidence is what enables clinicians, families, and young people to make genuinely informed decisions rather than decisions shaped by carefully constructed narratives. What makes gatekeeping dangerous is that it is crude or obvious. What makes it dangerous is that gatekeeping disguised as caution does not protect youth. It simply makes the harm invisible by renaming it. And when that gatekeeping is performed by someone with credentials, community standing, and the ability to quote mine evidence with precision, it becomes nearly impossible for families and young people to recognize what is actually happening until they are already caught in the machinery. In closing, while finishing this article, I found myself conflicted. Dr. Laura Targownik is very much likely operating from her sincerely held beliefs, and her position is one she probably has arrived to through her own means of contextualizing and rationalizing her own life experiences of being trans and transitioning, coupled to her formal education and training from within the values and principles she holds, portrayed through her own socio-political lens from which she views herself and the world around her. This undoubtedly leads to her to arrive to the conclusion she does. Whether this is due to her political and ideological alignment, out of her best educated analysis, or due to greater ambitions that result from this alignment, I can't say, and I won't begin to speculate. What we can say is this: the striking similarity between what she critiques in April and what she writes in June, combined with her own discussions and rationalizations witnessed across social media platforms in real time, confirms beyond question that a confirmation bias is self-evident and aligns with the likes of SCGM and various researchers, journalists, and platforms with a particular political and ideological stance. Was this piece pointed at the wrong person and in the wrong direction? Was it too critical against one of our own, and would it better serve our rainbow community if I left it on a shelf unpublished? Then the day before I finished the Polish on this article, Polish, not Polish, sorry, my bad. Oh my god, I'm so sorry, I'm not racist against Polish people. The day before I finished the polish on this article, Dr. Rachel Saunders published a great one on Medium titled, "Dear LGBTQI+ community, we need to talk about evidence." That perfectly captures why we are having this conversation. She made a simple observation. Articles claiming to be evidence-based must actually have and show evidence. They must link to their sources. They must show their work. As Saunders puts it, when I write from an evidence-based position, I link directly to my sources, allowing scrutiny of the data and constructive deconstruction of my arguments. This is essential to allow robust critique. You're Polish and offended. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm trying to read with a good cadence. I feel like when I was in high school, I was like 5% top reader, right? I love doing like different voices and shit when I was reading. I feel like now I'm definitely like top 0.1%, simply because everyone else has just fallen so far down. The amount of times I see people using the wrong then confusion or misspelling a very, very easy word or something, it just drives me crazy. It's always drove me crazy, but it drives me even more crazy today. We need a literacy. We need literacy in our country is what we need. But here's where it gets interesting. Saunders is equally clear about what happens when someone refuses to do that. When they claim authority without showing their work. When they cite studies they've not actually read, or read selectively, or misrepresented. When they build an entire argument on foundations they will not let you inspect. Saunders has a word for that. She calls it propaganda. And propaganda, she notes, potentially causes much more harm to our communities than they realized. Now, Targownik's June analysis does link to some of the studies she cites. Others we have to dig in order to find them. She does not acknowledge the limitations of her sources, the problematic affiliations of their authors, or the breadth of existing data that contradicts her conclusions, does not show how she arrived at conclusions the evidence does not support, presents selective analysis as fact while hiding the apparatus that selected them, wrapped in her credentials as authority, and her identity as a shield. To summarize the words of one data-driven transsexual, they have a preferred outcome and they selectively promote narratives and evidence that seek to eliminate one particular modality of care for gender-distressed youth. This is precisely what happens here, and in the closing words of Dr. Saunders, it is not too much to ask for those claiming authority to show their working out, to cite their sources, provide valid reasoning based on evidence they claim to have. Otherwise, they are simply propagandists who potentially cause much more harm to our communities than they realize. Well, thought-provoking piece. Lots to think about here. I do want to say that, like, I think, not a big fan of Benjamin Ryan, not a big fan of what he has to say. I also find that very often when you get into the meat and potatoes of a lot of these studies regarding gender-affirming care, a lot of them do not support the conclusions that people often say they do, and that cuts both ways, I think. I think, like I said just a few seconds ago, there's a literacy crisis in our country and in the world right now, and it's even harder for the layperson to read some of these papers and interpret from it the conclusion that they're meant to. You know, even if you scroll to the bottom and you just read the conclusion, like most people will not do that, and so it's. You know, people who disseminate these kinds of things have a much greater responsibility now to make sure that the layperson can understand and, if they choose to, research the thing individually. When you're citing these evidence-based papers, there should be evidence to go along with it, right? I should be able to, like, go through the thing, like, here at the bottom, I should be able to, like, go through her sources and everything that I click here should, everything that I find here should say what she says it says. That's the way it should work. You know, we should be able to trust that. But I think people got a little too comfortable with trusting things by default, and they don't read their stuff anymore. But okay, that's the end of that segment.